He had always believed himself to be the honorable bastard of Eddard Stark, born in the cold of the north where dire wolves prowled the forests and snows threatened to bury all beneath their silent blanket. He had grown up hearing the derision in men's voices when they spoke his name, or seeing the pitying smiles from those like Maester Luwin and Old Nan. Bastard. Snow. These words followed him like a shadow through the hallways of Winterfell and beyond. His choices in life had ever been shaped by that single truth. He was not legitimate, not recognized, not a true Stark. Yet when he learned of the secret kept from him, the terrible and wonderful truth of his parentage, that he was no Snow at all, but the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, everything changed. He had asked himself, in the dark hours before dawn, what it meant to be a Targaryen. He stood alone, grappling with a new identity both staggering and unsettling. Targaryens were conquerors, dragon lords from the ancient civilization of Valyria. They had forged the 7 kingdoms by fire and blood. Jon had sworn an oath to the Night's Watch once, to forsake titles and claims, to hold no lands, to father no children. But the war against the dead and the treacheries he had witnessed within the Watch had eroded the illusions of that vow. He had fought, bled, and died, only to be brought back to a life he never thought he'd have. In that second life, it seemed the gods had chosen him for something far greater than wearing black on the wall. The blood of the dragon, he thought, was in his veins. It was a bond to conquest and power that he had never truly known or claimed. He felt lost at first. The burden of heritage pressed upon him with a terrible weight. Jon knew that if he declared himself a Targaryen, the realm would be thrown into turmoil. Daenerys Stormborn, the Dragon Queen, was rumored to be forging alliances across the narrow sea, seeking to claim the Iron Throne in her own right. The Lannisters still held sway in King's Landing, perched precariously on the seat her father had once called his own. All the while, the North was trying to recover from the War of the Five Kings. Robb Stark, the young Wolf King, was newly crowned and forging a path to independence for his people. The Boltons, the Freys, the Greyjoys, rivalries crackled like lightning across the land. It was in the crypts beneath Winterfell that Jon had first revealed his truth to those he loved. He could still see the flickering glow of torches dancing on the ancient statues of the kings in the north and the lords of Winterfell. There in the silence, with only the dust and the echoes of the dead, he told his sisters Sansa and Arya that he was not truly their brother but their cousin. Bran's visions had confirmed it, and Samwell Tarly's meticulous research in the annals of the Citadel sealed the truth. Jon Snow was Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The two girls stared at him in disbelief. The crypt echoed with the weight of the admission. Sansa's face was a mask of conflicting emotion, anger at the betrayal of secrets, sorrow for the lie that shaped their entire lives, and a flicker of hope that perhaps the realm now possessed a more righteous leader than any Lannister or any foreign queen could claim. Yet it was in the hours that followed that an idea took hold. Jon had been trained all his life to serve, to honor the Stark name even if it wasn't truly his, to uphold the vows he had taken. He had remained on the wall, sacrificed safety and happiness for duty. But time had changed him, war had scarred him, and death itself had touched him. He had seen men shattered by terror, seen the boundaries of mortal existence crossed. There was no going back to the simple loyal soldier he once was. And if the legacy of Targaryen blood was his to claim, if the destiny of the 7 kingdoms was, in truth, his birthright, then perhaps he had a responsibility to bring order. To unite the realm in a way that had not been possible under the mad hatred of Joffrey or the cunning manipulations of Cersei. He considered how he might lead. If he was indeed heir, others would challenge him, Daenerys Targaryen first among them. But Daenerys was far away, across the sea in Meereen, bogged down by the politics of Slaver's Bay. The Lannisters were in King's Landing, holding the crown with Tywin's iron fist and Cersei's cunning. There were other pretenders to the throne. Stannis Baratheon had declared himself rightful king by virtue of Robert's blood, yet his forces were battered and broken after the Blackwater. Then there was Robb Stark, his brother in all but blood, crowned king in the north by his men. Robb's aims were independence for the north, not the Iron Throne. But independence itself would threaten the unity that Jon now believed was necessary. Unity was the only shield strong enough to protect humanity from the cold wind that rose in the far north, the threat that once haunted his dreams. He thought of the White Walkers, though word of their threat had spread too slowly, disbelieved by lords and small folk alike. He thought of how the realms of men needed a single hand to guide them if they were to face the storms that brewed beyond the wall. He had died once for daring to unite wildlings and kneelers. Would he die again if he dared to unite the entire realm under a single banner? Was that not the purpose for which he was resurrected? Yet part of him dreaded the notion. He had no taste for power. He had never yearned to command beyond necessity. But Eddard Stark had once taught him that a man's duty was often the hardest path. The only path that mattered. The plan formed slowly as a flicker of light in darkness. He shared it with Samwell Tarly and with Davos Seaworth. Samwell, though timid and uncertain, believed in the prophecy of the prince that was promised, believed that the song of ice and fire must come to fruition in Jon's lifeblood. Davos, for his part, simply believed in Jon Snow as a good man who could bring justice to a realm starved of it. Their counsel fueled Jon's sense of purpose, and so he resolved to claim the Iron Throne, to gather the houses beneath one banner, whether they came willingly or not. Winter was coming, and the living could not afford divisions. He needed allies. The first he sought was the North. Robb Stark was not just the king in the North. He was also the only brother Jon had ever truly known, a man he loved and respected. Jon journeyed to his brother's war camp in the Riverlands with a heavy heart. He brought with him a retinue of loyal northern warriors who had once followed him at the wall, men who had fought the wildlings and revered him as commander. They traveled under a new banner, the Stark direwolf quartered with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. The symbol was as shocking as it was provocative, and word spread quickly that Jon Snow, newly revealed as Aegon Targaryen, came to the king in the north to parley. Robb met him in a hastily erected pavilion near the twins, freshly recovered from the wounds inflicted by betrayal. The remains of the Red Wedding were still fresh in memory, though in this altered fate perhaps the slaughter was cut short or changed by timely interventions. Jon sensed the hostility in the Northmen, men who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons in the war. They were loyal to the Stark cause, loyal to Robb's claim. And here was Jon, a new Targaryen, a house many Northerners hated and distrusted since the days when Ned Stark's father and brother were burned alive by the Mad King. Robb sat upon a carved wooden chair, wrapped in a cloak of direwolf fur. His eyes betrayed hurt at the sight of Jon, as if his brother had somehow turned against him. Jon knelt. He would not supplant Robb's leadership among the northern men, but he told the assembled lords a story of Rhaegar's secret marriage to Lyanna Stark, of how Eddard Stark had protected that child at the cost of dishonor and suspicion. He spoke of the White Walkers, the threat to all life, and how he believed the realm must stand united or perish in the darkness. When he rose, his eyes met Robb's, and the tension in the air felt sharper than the coldest wind. Robb listened, his face carved like stone, unreadable. Only after the hush grew did Robb speak in a voice that trembled with carefully controlled anger. "This is your claim, then?" he asked. "That you are the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, our father's own nephew? That the crown is yours by the grace of Targaryen blood, even while I hold the North as an independent kingdom?" Jon nodded, struggling to keep his voice firm yet calm. He explained he had no desire to see the North subjugated or humiliated, but a fractured realm could not withstand what was coming. If the North insisted on standing apart, it risked isolation, it risked standing alone when the dead marched. To Robb, that sounded like a threat. To the lords gathered, it bordered on sacrilege. They had declared for the Starks and for the independence of the North, one with blood and sacrifice. Why bend the knee to the spawn of the Mad King? Jon felt the weight of those stares. He remembered how Eddard Stark had once told him that to lead meant to be a father to his people. "I would do this not for myself," he said, "but for all men. If you will not submit willingly, I will have no choice but to press my claim by the sword. I wish it otherwise, but that is my duty." A hush fell. Robb's hand gripped the pommel of his sword. Around them, Northmen bristled. It seemed impossible that Jon Snow, quiet bastard of Winterfell, would ever utter such words. Yet necessity guided him. His cause was not petty ambition. If he was to be the unifier, he had to bring everyone under his banner, even if it meant turning brother against brother. The shadows of the pavilion flickered, and there, for an eternal moment, Jon saw ghosts in the gloom. His father's silent approval or condemnation, the spirits of the fallen, the wrath of winter itself. Robb's pride flared. He refused. In the fierce tradition of the North, He declared that no Targaryen would ever again rule over the men who had suffered under Aerys' tyranny. He vowed that the North had paid too dearly for the independence it had claimed, and it would not be relinquished. He would not kneel. When he said those words, the Northmen roared their agreement. The tension mounted to a fever pitch. Steel clattered as men reached for their blades. Jon had come prepared for this. He did not wish to shed blood, but neither would he shrink from the step he had set upon. With a snap of his fingers, a horn blast echoed through the camp. Knights loyal to Jon, men of a new alliance he had forged with certain houses in the Vale, whom Littlefinger had swayed into believing in a Targaryen restoration, marched upon the perimeter. A line of armed men blocked the exits, capturing the king in the north in a net of steel. Shouts rose from Robb's outraged loyalists, yet Jon's forces were prepared, disciplined. There were no flapping banners, no triumphant war cries, just the methodical ring of men who closed in, ensuring no escape. Jon forced himself not to tremble. This was not the honorable approach Ned Stark might have taken. But Ned Stark was dead, and the times demanded harsh measures. Robb, furious, demanded to be set free. Jon stepped forward, explaining that he would not kill his brother, but nor would he permit defiance that could splinter the realm. He asked Robb one last time to bend the knee, to swear fealty to the Targaryen claim so that they might face the coming doom as one. Robb's silence was answer enough. The struggle was short and brutal. Jon's loyal knights subdued Robb's own guard, though blood was spilled. The king in the north's face was pale with betrayal, confusion, heartbreak. Jon felt no triumph in taking his own brother prisoner. The lords of the north howled and spat curses, but the ring of steel was too thick and the final outcome was inevitable. That night, the camp quieted and Jon ordered that Robb be treated as an honored guest, not a captive. He knew the North's spirit would not be broken easily, but he believed that if he could speak with Robb alone, away from the prying eyes of the lords, perhaps an accord could be reached. He was determined not to repeat the cruelties of the Mad King. Yet the very act of seizing Robb was an echo of Targaryen conquest. By force, if necessary. In Robb's tent, the air was charged with tension. Robb had no sword, but his eyes were lethal. Jon stood across from him, his own emotions in turmoil. He had never wanted to do this. He had admired Robb all his life, looked up to him as the perfect son, the perfect Stark. But the necessity of unity demanded drastic choices. Could Robb not see the bigger picture? They spoke in low voices. Jon reminded Robb of what lay beyond the wall. He explained again that if men did not unite, they would be consumed by the cold. Robb said that while he respected the threat Jon spoke of, the North had its own choice to make, and this was not the way to persuade free men. He accused Jon of falling prey to the Targaryen madness, of believing that might made right. The words cut deep into Jon's chest, for he had always tried to be fair, honest, and compassionate. But the memory of his death, of the treachery at Castle Black, reminded him that sometimes honor alone was not enough. Sometimes one had to be willing to do what was needed to save the realm, however dark it might seem. Robb was not easily swayed. The conversation ended in a stalemate, and Jon left the tent with a heavy heart. Outside, the night was cold, a small taste of the winter he had encountered beyond the wall. As he stared at the dark sky, the stars seemed distant and aloof. He wondered if the gods were watching this drama unfold. Would they condemn him for what he had done? Could they see that his heart was torn in two? The days that followed were tense. Jon's forces kept Robb under close watch while continuing to gather allies. Some of the lords of the Riverlands, weary from war, were tempted to side with a Targaryen who promised unity and the end of hostilities. Others cursed Jon's name as a traitor, a kinslayer in spirit if not in deed. Rumors traveled swiftly. Men whispered that the bastard of Winterfell had kidnapped the king in the north to claim the Iron Throne. Jon's reputation grew dark wings, carrying fear and uncertainty. Still, to maintain order, Jon declared no harm would come to Robb. If any man dared raise a blade to kill the king in the north, they would face death themselves. He wanted peace, not fratricide. Sansa arrived with Arya in tow, traveling under heavy guard. They had worried that war between Jon and Robb might tear the north apart. Their presence brought a fleeting sense of family to the camp. Sansa tried to reason with Jon, to remind him that the bond of blood, Stark blood, was not so easily cast aside. Arya, too, though hardened by her own journeys, stood quietly by Robb's side, looking at Jon with a mixture of awe and betrayal. She recalled the boy who had once given her needle, a brother she loved. She saw a new man cloaked in Targaryen black and red, commanding armies and forging alliances by force. Frightened her. In private, Sansa begged Jon to consider a compromise. She argued that if he truly wished for unity, he should allow the North the autonomy it craved. Let Robb remain king in the North, allied to King Aegon Targaryen, but not subject to direct rule. Surely that alliance would be enough to face the enemy in the North. But Jon shook his head. He believed that a divided realm would collapse under the relentless tide of the undead. In the face of ultimate darkness, there could be only one realm, one king. He told her that the realm must see a single symbol of leadership, the three-headed dragon reclaimed from the ashes of House Targaryen. When she argued that the dire wolf of Stark was every bit as strong a symbol, Jon responded that if they marched south under two banners, the lords of Westeros would remain splintered, uncertain which claim to honor. Sansa's face burned with hurt. Arya's eyes smoldered with silent fury. But neither sister could dissuade him. Jon was resolute. The only question that remained was how to bring Robb to see reason. Until that moment came, Robb remained in gentle captivity, a symbol of northern defiance imprisoned within the ring of Targaryen arms. Even so, Jon did not idle. He sent ravens south, proclaiming his birthright. He announced himself as Aegon Targaryen, the true heir of Rhaegar, and demanded fealty from the lords of the Reach, the Westerlands, and the Vale. He offered them peace in exchange for loyalty. The boldness of such a declaration shook the Seven Kingdoms. The Lannisters responded with a counter-declaration, calling Jon a usurper and an upstart. King Tommen, if still on the throne, or perhaps Joffrey if events had not yet claimed him, or even Cersei reigning as Queen Regent, whoever spoke for the Lannisters now refused to yield. War loomed once again, but this time with different players. The small folk whispered that the Targaryen, the bastard dragon, might well be the one to break the Lannisters' hold. Others worried that he would be no better than the Mad King. Meanwhile, rumors spread that Daenerys Targaryen herself was on her way across the narrow sea, her dragons in tow. For the first time in many years, Westeros trembled on the edge of another cataclysmic war. Jon recognized that securing the North was a priority. If the North refused him, it would remain rebellious, and he could not fight a war on two fronts, against the undead in the far north and the Lannisters in the south, while still battling his own brother's forces. Though it pained him, he resolved to force a submission from Robb, if peaceful means would not suffice. He could not afford to let personal sentiment overshadow the looming crisis, and so he moved his forces swiftly and relentlessly. The Northmen loyal to Robb were scattered, reeling from the betrayal at the twins that had cut short the War of the Five Kings. Though they tried to gather strength, Jon's alliance with certain lords of the Vale and some northern houses that believed in his cause allowed him to overwhelm pockets of resistance. Small battles erupted across the Riverlands, each further entrenching the notion that Jon Snow was no longer the humble boy they'd known. At the same time, he sought to spare bloodshed where he could. He sent envoys to each castle, offering terms. Bend the knee and join his cause, or resist and risk complete annihilation. Some agreed, preferring the promise of a stable monarchy to the uncertainty of continued civil war. Others resisted, and the result was swift and brutal. Jon discovered that war on this scale demanded ruthless actions. He watched men burn while locked inside their own holdfasts, and mothers weeping over the corpses of sons who had chosen to resist. Each atrocity carved a scar on Jon's spirit, but he pressed forward. Word began to spread that the bastard of Winterfell had gone mad with power, that he was as ruthless as any Targaryen conqueror from generations past. As the rumors grew, so too did the fear in Robb's heart. He could not reconcile the Jon Snow he had known with this new king's hard decisions. Whenever they spoke, Jon tried to explain that he had no love for cruelty, but war was war and necessity was a pitiless master. Robb told him that he had become the very thing their father had fought to overthrow decades ago. Jon insisted there was no parallel to Aerys Targaryen's madness. He was not a sadist nor a tyrant. But the realm only saw the unstoppable march of Targaryen black and red. On a cold morning, Jon's forces approached the gates of Riverrun where the Tullys still held out hope. Edmure Tully, uncertain and desperate, tried to parley but found the ring of siege weapons in place. Behind the banners of the Targaryen cause, he glimpsed a caged Robb Stark, unchained yet guarded, standing in silent condemnation. Jon promised Edmure the same terms he offered all: bend the knee or be besieged until hunger and disease forced surrender. It was not the gallant approach, but the Tullus had no illusions left about chivalry after the horrors of war. They surrendered, opening their gates, and Jon's host marched in. Riverrun's banner changed overnight, a dire wolf overshadowed by the three-headed dragon. Edmure was permitted to keep his lordship under the condition that he swear fealty to King Aegon Targaryen. As humiliating as it was, Edmure accepted for the safety of his people. Robb watched in bitter silence. He refused to kneel, refused to utter the words of fealty. But as Jon continued to gather momentum, capturing key strongholds and forging alliances with those who deemed him more legitimate than the Lannisters, Robb's position grew hopeless. The sight of the realm bending one castle after another to Jon's claim was like a twisted reflection of Aegon the Conqueror's campaign 3 centuries past. This time the North was the final holdout, refusing to yield. But the North had already been savaged by war, betrayed by Boltons and Freys, battered by Ironborn raids. Its new king was now a prisoner, albeit an honored one. Jon tried time and again to remind Robb why this was necessary. He spoke of the prophecy, the White Walkers, the doom that threatened to swallow them all. He told Robb that if the North stood alone, it would fall alone. If they joined him, the entire realm would stand as one, with all the resources and manpower of Westeros marshaled against the common foe. Yet pride and principle prevented Robb from bending. He insisted the North had suffered too long under the Iron Throne's yoke. He would not surrender the independence so hard-won by the blood of his bannermen. In the midst of these negotiations, whispers came from the south that Daenerys Targaryen had landed on Dragonstone with her dragons and an army of Unsullied and was forging alliances with certain lords in the Stormlands. Jon realized that the game had just become far more complex. Now the realm had 2 Targaryens claiming the throne and the Lannisters still clinging to power in King's Landing. The question of who would rule was no longer a simple matter of intimidation and fealty, it was a contest of legitimacy, force, and cunning. Jon could not afford to be half-hearted. He had to secure the North, then march south to confront Daenerys or form an alliance with her. But an alliance seemed unlikely. 2 claimants to the same throne could not easily coexist. Meanwhile, the Lannisters still had teeth, and King's Landing was a prize that would demand more than a show of arms to capture, especially with wildfire rumored to be hidden beneath the city. Time was of the essence. Winter had set in, the snows creeping further south than ever. The land was turning harsh, making warfare more difficult. The undead threat loomed, though news of the White Walkers was treated with skepticism by southern lords. Jon decided to press for final submission from Robb. With Robb at his side, willing or not, the northern lords might yield. As the snows began to swirl, Jon marched northward, crossing the Neck and approaching the Moat Cailin. The fortress was battered, having changed hands multiple times, but it remained the gateway to the north. Jon's host, augmented by new allies from the Riverlands and the Vale, was strong. Yet the defenders within the fortress, loyal to the king in the north, had prepared for a siege. Jon, believing one swift stroke might end the standoff, brought Robb forward. Before the gathered defenders on the ramparts, he stood with his brother in chains, demanding the gates be opened lest the rightful king's justice be meted out. The men on the walls hesitated. They saw the face of their king, silent, proud, refusing to beg for rescue. They also saw the size of Jon's army, the ring of steel that seemed without limit. After a tense parley, the fortress surrendered, opening its gates to the new Targaryen king. One by one, the major strongholds of the north surrendered rather than face the combined might of the Targaryen alliance. Sansa and Arya, who had returned to Winterfell ahead of the host, tried to broker a peaceful resolution for the sake of their people. But the sight of Targaryen banners flying in the winter winds around Winterfell sparked outrage among those loyal to Stark rule. Some openly wept to see the dire wolf overshadowed by the 3-headed dragon. Others recalled the old days of Targaryen oppression, the memory of Ned Stark's father and brother burning. The friction boiled over in pockets of rebellion and sabotage. Jon's men found themselves harried by hidden archers, by sabotage in the night. And each time men died, Jon felt another pang of guilt at what he was forcing upon his own homeland. Finally, the day came when Jon stood in the Great Hall of Winterfell, the seat of House Stark, wearing the black and red cloak of House Targaryen pinned by a dragon brooch. Ghost padded at his side, a reminder of Jon's own connection to the Starks. The hall was filled with Northmen, Riverlanders, and Vale lords, some loyal to Robb, others to Jon, many uncertain where their true loyalties lay. Outside, the snows fell thick upon the castle walls, the wind wailing. At the high seat where Ned Stark once presided, Jon placed himself, though he refused to sit until the matter was settled. Robb stood before him, unbound for this final meeting, but guards flanked him. Tension crackled in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. Jon took a breath. "My lords," he began, "we stand at a crossroads. The living face the greatest threat in our history, a darkness that knows no mercy. Winter is upon us, and soon the dead will march. I have offered my hand to the north so that we might stand together, not as enemies, but as one people. And still the king in the north refuses to acknowledge my claim." Robb stepped forward. The cut above his brow had healed, but his eyes were fierce. "I do refuse. My lords named me king in the north in the sight of gods and men. I will not bend the knee to any Targaryen, even if he wears my father's face. We are the free north. We have bled and died for that freedom." A murmur spread through the hall. Some shouted for Robb, others murmured in support of Jon. The guards remained watchful, hands on the hilts of their swords. Sansa and Arya watched from the side, anguish plain on their features. Jon steadied himself. "I do not wish to be your enemy, but I cannot allow the north to stand apart. It would tear the realm asunder. We must be united under one crown or be devoured by the terror lurking beyond the wall. You do not believe me? Ask Bran, his visions confirm what I have seen with my own eyes." Robb's hand clenched. "I believe in the threat, but you mistake the cause. The North would rally to face it if you asked. You do not need our submission. You only need our cooperation. Let us keep our king, let the North remain free, and we will fight beside you as allies, not as subjects." Jon's voice grew tense. "Allies break apart when ambitions and grievances arise. Subjects must obey a single ruler. The difference may mean life or death in what is to come." A hush fell. It was a stark contrast of ideals. One man demanded the absolute submission of the North for the sake of unity, the other demanded the autonomy of his people who had already lost so much under Southern dominion. Both were men shaped by Ned Stark's legacy, but both saw that legacy differently. Robb thought Ned would never have stooped to forcing the North to bend with threats of violence. Jon believed that Ned would have done whatever necessary to save the realm from an unimaginable evil. At last, Jon exhaled, a cloud of breath in the cold hall. "I ask you one final time, brother. Kneel, and the realm will be as one. We can face the oncoming storm with all our might. The bloodshed can end here." Robb shook his head. "If that is the price of your peace, then there shall be none." He turned, scanning the hall. "You know me, my lords. You named me king in the north. If we bend the knee today, everything we fought for is undone. The north will be subjugated again, and the sacrifices of so many will be for naught." A chorus of low agreement rumbled among the men still loyal to him. Jon set his jaw. He did not want this. He stepped forward slowly until he stood only a pace away from Robb. Guards tensed, uncertain, but Jon made no move to draw a weapon. Instead, he sank to one knee in front of Robb, to the astonishment of all present. He bowed his head. "I love you, Robb," he said softly. "You have ever been my brother, and I have always admired you. I do this not out of pride or vanity, but the dead are coming, and if we are not one, we will fall." Robb's breath caught. The king in the north seemed unsteady for a moment, uncertain what to do. But then he drew a breath and looked around at the men of the north, men who had marched behind him through fields of blood. He thought of Grey Wind, his slain direwolf. He thought of Catelyn Stark, his mother, and how she had hated Jon for reasons tied to his bastard status. He thought of his father, who had died in the name of honor, and how it had led them all to ruin. At last, Robb spoke, his voice trembling with fervor. "I cannot." The air seemed to crystallize. Jon rose slowly, sadness in his eyes. "Then you leave me no choice," he murmured. A gesture from Jon, and the guards closed in, seizing Robb's arms. A cry of anguish came from Sansa, and Arya made to lunge forward, but more guards blocked her way. Robb's loyal bannermen roared in protest, though they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Helpless, Jon's face was pale, sweat beading on his brow. The entire hall tensed, as if the old stones themselves waited for the final blow. Jon's voice cut through the din, harsh as an ice-laden wind. "Robb Stark, you stand accused of treason against the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, Aegon Targaryen, by refusing to submit to his lawful rule. The sentence, by the laws of the realm, is death." A tumult of voices erupted, rage and despair filling Winterfell's great hall. Sansa screamed for Jon to stop. Arya fought against the guards, her eyes burning with a lethal light. Lords shouted for mercy. Others demanded that Jon follow the old ways, that the man who passes the sentence swing the sword. It was as though the world had turned upside down, brother about to kill brother, all in the name of a fragile cause. And yet, Jon's eyes were bleak. He had sworn to do whatever it took, but his heart pounded with each beat, as if it might shatter his ribcage. He gave Robb a chance for final words. Robb's face was grim, acceptance mingled with fury. "You destroy the very thing you claim to save," he spat. "You are no better than the tyrants who came before you. When the dead come, you will stand alone." Jon trembled. In that moment, he felt the chill of the crypts, as if the dead of Stark ancestry were howling in protest. He thought of how Ned had always taught him that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. He reached out his hand, and one of his men handed him Longclaw. It felt heavier than it ever had, as if it bore the weight of 1,000 ghosts. Robb was forced to his knees. The onlookers fell silent, a hush as profound as a grave. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as though the entire world watched this pivotal act. Jon raised the Valyrian steel blade. His breath was ragged. Before him knelt the man he had loved as a brother, the king in the north. He tried to steady his hand, but it shook. Some part of him was screaming, telling him not to do this, that there had to be another way. But each moment that passed brought the realm closer to chaos. If Robb lived, the North would never submit. The realm would remain divided, and that division might doom them all when the White Walkers arrived. Jon closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, remembering a simpler time when he and Robb had sparred in the courtyard, teased each other at table, raced across the fields with dire wolves at their sides. That past was as dead as summer. He opened his eyes and saw Robb meeting his gaze. There was no fear, only sorrow and defiance. Jon inhaled, raised Longclaw high, and brought the blade down. In the instant before steel met flesh, time seemed to slow. Robb's hair caught the torchlight, a final glimmer of the warmth that once bound them as brothers. And then it ended. Longclaw severed Robb's head in a single sweep, a clean blow just as Ned had always taught them to do. Blood spattered across the dais, onto Jon's boots, onto the ancient stones. A collective gasp swept the hall. Sansa collapsed, sobbing, while Arya gave an inhuman cry that echoed against the walls. Some of Robb's bannermen roared in anguish, while others stood stunned. The great hall was filled with the thunder of hearts broken in two. Jon stood there, sword lowered, breathing like he had just fought a dozen men. Robb's body slumped to the floor, a scarlet pool spreading. The head had rolled away, hair matted with blood, eyes still open in an expression of shock. Silence fell, thick as winter snow. There was no turning back. Jon had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had slain his own brother by law, his cousin by blood, for the sake of a crown he never wanted but was compelled to claim. He turned slowly to face the assembled lords, his face etched with grief. "I gave him every chance," he said, voice raw. "Let it be known that I did this for the realm, for the living. I will forever carry the sin." He inhaled, then raised Longclaw, its blade still slick with red. "Now, who among you still refuses to bend the knee?" An icy hush. The men looked upon the severed head of their king, then back at Jon, who stood like a statue carved from sorrow and determination. Some bent the knee immediately, trembling. Others hesitated, but one by one they lowered themselves, acknowledging the unstoppable reality of a Targaryen who had just enforced his claim in blood. The old ways had been obeyed, the man who passed the sentence had swung the sword. But the old ways had also been perverted beyond measure. This was a new era, shaped by the ghost of a conquered north and the unstoppable will of the bastard dragon. Sansa wept quietly, her eyes hollow, as if she could not believe this was real. Arya glared, tears burning her cheeks, murder in her gaze. Jon's heart felt hollow. There was no triumph in this moment, only a necessary evil. He would rule the north now, for he had broken its chosen king. He dreaded the weight of this act. Perhaps he was cursed. Perhaps this was why the gods had allowed him a second life, to become the monster necessary to unite the realm. He turned and strode from the great hall, holding Longclaw limply. He did not speak to Sansa or Arya. He had no words that could salve the wound he had inflicted. Outside, the snow stung his face like needles. He lifted his gaze to the sky, letting the cold burn his cheeks as if it might freeze the tears that threatened to fall. A few days later, mourning ceremonies were held for Robb Stark. Jon insisted on giving him the honors due a king in the north. He lit the pyre himself, standing solemnly as the flames consumed what remained of the brother he had loved. Many Northmen, including Sansa and Arya, refused to stand beside Jon in that moment. They clustered around the pyre on the other side, their silent grief mingled with fury at the Targaryen tyrant in their midst. In that blaze, Jon felt as though he was burning some part of himself away. He had crossed a threshold. The realm was now his to shape, but at what cost? News spread quickly throughout Westeros of Robb Stark's execution. Many branded Jon Snow a kinslayer, a man cursed by the gods, unfit to rule. Others believed it showed a ruthless determination that might rival the Lannisters. Small folk whispered that if he could kill his own brother, no one was safe from his wrath. Yet lords who once wavered in their loyalty found their courage failing. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, had united the North, albeit through terror and heartbreak. If he could do that to his own brother, what would he do to those he scarcely knew? The northern houses, though bitter, bent the knee. Some did so out of fear, others out of reluctant acceptance that war had brought them nothing but ruin. Winterfell now flew the Targaryen banner, black and red, though a dire wolf was sometimes displayed below it, a concession Jon hoped would appease the Northerners. It was a hollow gesture, overshadowed by the fresh memory of Robb's death. Sansa remained in the castle, distant and cold toward Jon, fulfilling little more than the role of a hostage in her own home. Arya, the wolf girl, vanished soon after the funeral. The guards failed to locate her. When Jon heard the news, he felt a cold weight in his gut. He sensed she might be out there somewhere, plotting his death. He could hardly blame her. With the North subdued, Jon set about preparing for the true war he foresaw. He commanded the forging of new alliances, the mustering of soldiers, the stockpiling of dragonglass from Dragonstone, if he could secure it, and the forging of new weaponry. He sought to send ravens to every corner of the realm, warning them of the White Walkers' threat, urging them to unite under his banner. Yet the name he now carried was tainted by fratricide. Some lords scorned his pleas, seeing them only as the manipulations of a conqueror. Some still believed that the talk of the dead was but a tale used to justify tyranny. At the same time, Cersei Lannister in King's Landing, or Taming, or Joffrey, whoever held the throne in that uncertain timeline, sneered at his claims, calling him a usurper and a murderer. Plans were laid by the Lannisters to hold their ground to repel any invasion from the north. Then there was Daenerys. She heard of this new Targaryen, a man claiming to be her nephew, and her immediate response was suspicion, perhaps even outrage. She had spent her life believing she was the last Targaryen. Now, this stranger emerged, backed by the North, claiming the throne that she believed was hers by blood. She had dragons, she had armies. She had already freed Slaver's Bay and inspired thousands. But she also had new burdens. Her forces had faced plague and discord after crossing. The Dornians might align with her out of hatred for the Lannisters, but other regions hesitated. The game was about to shift drastically, and no one knew how the pieces would fall. Jon summoned his most trusted advisors, Davos, Samwell, a few loyal lords from the Vale and the North who had not turned on him. He laid out a plan to march south, unify the realm by toppling the Lannisters in King's Landing, and force a confrontation with Daenerys. If she would treat with him, they might find an accord. If she refused, then it would be war once more. But the immediate concern was that winter was tightening its grip, making any southern campaign a gamble. And the White Walkers drew closer each day, an army of the dead that might sweep the living aside if they did not muster a unified defense. In the days that followed, the castle of Winterfell felt cursed. The ghost of Robb Stark lingered in every corridor. The men of the North regarded Jon with sullen loyalty at best, simmering hatred at worst. Sansa carried herself as the Lady of Winterfell, but she and Jon rarely exchanged words. When they did, it was with a strained politeness that belied the agony beneath. One day, Jon met her in the Godwood, beside the heart tree, its red leaves stirring in the cold breeze. She stood there, her cloak drawn tight around her shoulders, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Jon approached, uncertain if she would spurn him. "I had no choice," he murmured, though the words sounded hollow even to his ears. She didn't turn to face him. "There is always a choice," she said in a trembling voice. "You could have let him live. You could have sought another way." Jon's throat felt tight. He would not bend. The North was on the brink of rebellion. "If I allowed him to defy me," she whipped around, eyes blazing. "He was your brother." Her voice cracked on the final word, cutting Jon like a blade. You talk of saving the realm, but at what cost? Do you even hear yourself? Do you realize what you've done? He lowered his head. I do, he said, the memory of that final swing of long claw seared into his mind. I'll bear it until the day I die. Sansa trembled with suppressed rage and sorrow. Then I hope that day comes swiftly, she spat and turned her back on him, leaving him alone with the old gods. He stared at the heart tree's weeping face, remembering how Ned used to kneel there, how Robb had once prayed for guidance. Jon felt emptier than ever. Perhaps the gods were judging him now. A fortnight later, Jon began the march south. The Targaryen banner flew over the combined forces of the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale. Some came willingly, believing in Jon's cause or hoping to profit from new conquests. Others marched under the threat of punishment. But the army was formidable, a patchwork of grudging alliances that might tear itself apart if Jon failed to maintain control. His first destination was Dragonstone, that ancient seat of House Targaryen, a strategic outpost. It was rumored that Daenerys was close by, gathering strength in the Stormlands. If so, he wished to negotiate. The crossing of the Neck was arduous under the snowfall, and the march was slow. Along the way, Jon sent scouts to gather news of the White Walkers. Reports trickled in of attacks on small villages north of the Wall, wildlings fleeing south. Winter was tightening its claws, and the nights grew longer, the darkness deeper. As Jon's host drew near the Trident, messengers from King's Landing approached under a banner of truce. Their offer was simple: the crown recognized neither Jon Snow nor Daenerys Targaryen and declared them both rebels. Any who allied with the Targaryens would be seen as traitors. The Lannisters threatened to raze any region that gave shelter to the so-called bastard dragon. In reply, Jon sent their envoys back with a stark message: the realm did not need the false rule of the Lannisters any longer. Soon, King's Landing would bow or burn. Harsh words, but necessary in the brutal game they played. The memory of Robb's execution weighed on him each time he delivered such ultimatums. He had become what he despised, a man who believed that fear was a weapon to secure order. Part of him justified it by saying that the realm's survival depended on unity. Part of him loathed it. That conflict raged within him day after day as he led his army south through the bitter cold. The men around him saw a resolute king, but inside, Jon felt hollowed out. Eventually, on a rocky stretch of coastline near Dragonstone, Jon received word that Daenerys's fleet had been spotted. She was making landfall, seeking to reclaim the fortress that had once been the seat of her ancestors. Jon arranged for a rendezvous under heavy guard. If an alliance were possible, they would both need to tread carefully. On a windswept beach of black sand, Jon dismounted alongside Davos while a group of unsullied Dothraki watched them warily. Daenerys herself arrived astride a dragon that descended from the clouded sky, terrifying the gathered men. Jon fought the instinct to reach for his sword when the monstrous creature landed, billows of sand swirling around its enormous claws. Daenerys dismounted with regal grace, her silver-gold hair flowing around her shoulders. Her violet eyes swept across Jon and his retinue, lingering on the Targaryen sigils that emblazoned their banners. Behind her, the dragon rumbled, smoke curling from its nostrils. The tension was thick as the biting wind. Jon and Daenerys stepped closer to one another, each flanked by loyal guards. They regarded each other in silence. Two living Targaryens, once thought extinct, now standing face to face on the soil their ancestors had once ruled. She spoke first. "You claim to be Aegon Targaryen, my brother's son," she said, her tone measured. "I have heard many tales of your deeds in the north, and the manner in which you took the crown." Jon's mouth felt dry. "I am who I say I am," he replied. "We are blood of the dragon. Rhaegar was my father. Lyanna Stark was my mother." Daenerys nodded once, eyes narrowed. "And you have made the North submit forcibly. I hear you even killed your own brother by law, Robb Stark. Tell me, are these the qualities of a just ruler?" His jaw tightened. "I did what was necessary to unite the realm. If the White Walkers are not stopped, there will be no realm left. I would not have taken such actions if there had been another way." Daenerys studied him, a hint of cold fire in her gaze. "I freed cities and broke chains across the sea. I did not butcher my own family." The statement hung in the air, condemning. Jon's voice was tinged with regret. "You do not understand. You were not there. War demands terrible choices." He paused, letting the wind whip around them. I do not seek conflict with you, Daenerys Targaryen. I seek an alliance. We face a threat unlike any in history. The Dead March. She held his gaze, silent. He sensed she was judging him. Tyrion Lannister stood at her side, looking from one Targaryen to the other, his eyes sharp and searching. Missandei was behind Daenerys, posture rigid. Grey Worm and the Unsullied waited, disciplined and ready. Davos hovered near Jon, as if prepared to shield him from dragon fire. After a tense moment, Daenerys spoke again. You may be my nephew by blood, but I have crossed seas, freed slaves, and fought for the throne that was stolen from my family. I will not yield the throne to a man who used violence and kinslaying to seize his own kingdom. Jon took a step forward, struggling to keep his voice calm. I have no desire to rob you of what is rightfully yours, but I am the rightful heir of Rhaegar Targaryen, your elder brother. By the laws of succession, my claim supersedes yours. Daenerys' lips tightened. The dragon behind her shifted, letting out a low, menacing growl. The throne is mine by birth, by blood, and by conquest if need be. If we are truly blood of the dragon, we should not tear each other apart. But neither will I kneel. The standoff bristled with potential violence. Men reached for weapons, unsure if a single misstep would summon dragon fire. Jon raised a hand, halting his guards, and forced himself to speak with a measure of courtesy. We are family, Daenerys. We need not be enemies. Perhaps we can find a way to share the realm. Her laugh was short and bitter. The realm is not a meat pie to be split in half. There can be only one on the Iron Throne. I suggest you kneel and pledge yourself to me. If the threat beyond the wall is as dire as you claim, then we can ride north together. But I will not name you co-ruler. That is my final offer. For a moment, Jon imagined kneeling, ceding his claim, relinquishing the terrible burden he had carried since learning his true parentage. He thought of Robb's blood-staining long claw, the bitter sorrow in Sansa's eyes, the realm he had forced into unity for the sake of a single cause. Could he simply bend now, to someone who had not shed the same tears and spilled the same blood to unite the North? All that he had done would be for nothing. The North would never forgive him if he bent to another Targaryen after demanding their fealty through such brutality. And yet, was that not the honorable path, to save the realm at any personal cost? He glanced at Davos, who shook his head slightly, warning. The men behind Jon had risked everything for him. If he yielded, they would see it as a betrayal. They had followed him south in the name of the new Targaryen king, for better or worse. He squared his shoulders and met Daenerys' unwavering stare. I cannot do that, he said softly. Her face hardened. Then we are at an impasse. Tyrion Lannister spoke up, trying to diffuse the tension with logic. If the threat beyond the wall is real, I suggest we come to terms before we tear each other's armies apart. Is there truly no way for the two of you to find a compromise? Perhaps a marriage? He trailed off as Daenerys' gaze whipped to him. Jon's heart lurched at the notion of marrying Daenerys Targaryen. She was his aunt, though Targaryens had wed among themselves in the past. The idea both appalled and intrigued him, reminiscent of old Targaryen custom. But he saw no welcome in Daenerys' eyes. Marriage? She echoed, voice laced with scorn. To the kinslayer who claims my birthright? I think not. Jon could find no words. The tension reignited. The dragon behind Daenerys roared into the sky, and the men on both sides tensed. Daenerys turned, gathering her cloak around her. If you will not bend, then we have nothing further to discuss. My armies will march on King's Landing and claim the throne. If you choose to stand in my way, then you will face the same fate as any other pretender. She mounted her dragon, and a moment later the beast launched itself into the air, leaving a whirlwind of black sand and unsettled men. Jon watched her go, a heavy sense of foreboding settling in his chest. Another war, then? Another Targaryen civil war, if that was what it took. He stared at the churning sea, the sky dark with winter clouds. He thought of Robb's final words, and a chill crept over him. Would he truly stand alone when the final battle came? He returned to his army camp with a grim expression, relaying what had passed to his gathered captains. Some urged an immediate assault on Dragonstone before Daenerys could fortify it. Others counseled caution, citing the dragons she possessed. Ultimately, Jon resolved to march on King's Landing before Daenerys could make a deal with the Lannisters. If they allied, his cause was doomed. Better to strike swiftly, take the capital, and then force Daenerys to treat with him from a position of strength. The strategy was bold, perhaps reckless, but time was running out. The White Walkers would not wait, and so the Targaryen host turned west, skirting the Crownlands in a harsh winter campaign. The roads were clogged with snow, supply lines stretched thin, and marauders took advantage wherever they could. Yet Jon's determination was unshakable. He had not come this far at such a dreadful price to abandon his quest for a united realm. The nightmares of the dead haunted him each night, images of an endless horde of blue-eyed whites swarming over the living. He had to end the southern war quickly, or no one would survive the northern onslaught. As they drew near King's Landing, word reached him that Daenerys had sacked a portion of the Rose Road with her dragons, forcing Tyrell bannermen to bend the knee or burn. The news was conflicting, painting her as both liberator and destroyer. Jon brooded over the parallels to his own campaign in the north. She, too, was forging alliances by fire. When they finally converged upon the capital, the city was bristling with Lannister defenses. Daenerys' forces were camped on one side, Jon's on another, the Lannisters barricaded behind the walls. 3 armies, each with a different claim, glowering at one another through winter storms and the acrid smoke of campfires. A siege began, complicated by the threat of dragons overhead. Jon's men dug trenches, erected siege towers, and readied scorpions capable of wounding a dragon, technology stolen from Qyburn's designs. Daenerys harried the Lannisters by day with dragonfire, but avoided Jon's lines for the moment, uncertain if she should treat him as an ally against the Lannisters or as an enemy. The Lannisters, pinned between 2 Targaryen forces, grew desperate. Civilians within King's Landing starved or froze, cursing all claimants equally. Messengers darted among the camps, carrying proposals of alliance or pleas for neutrality. The question lingered, who would yield first, or would blood be spilled on all sides until the city lay in ashes? Tyrion tried to broker an accord between Jon and Daenerys, emphasizing that neither had reason to trust the Lannisters, but if they wasted time fighting each other, Cersei might unleash wildfire and destroy them all. Yet neither Targaryen was willing to kneel to the other, and so the stalemate dragged on. Days turned into weeks, each side growing more desperate. Winter's chill crept through their tents. Soldiers died of exposure or deserted. Sporadic skirmishes erupted. The watchers on the walls of King's Landing saw a winter the city had never truly known, turning the fields white, freezing the waters of the Blackwater Bay. Rumors began to trickle in from the north of entire villages disappearing beneath the onslaught of whites. Some spoke of the fall of Eastwatch by the sea, overrun by the dead. The army of the dead was marching south, unstoppable. And here, at the southern capital, the living bickered and slaughtered each other over who might wear a melting crown. At last, the unthinkable happened. Reports came of whites crossing the neck, overrunning Moat Cailin. The undead were in the heart of the continent now, unstoppable. Sansa and what remained of the northern leadership fled further south, barely staying ahead of the tide. If an army of the living did not stand against them soon, the dead would sweep across the land. Jon realized with horror that time had run out. He stood in his tent, gazing at a tattered map pinned to a table. Each day brought them closer to a cataclysm that no man could hope to stop alone. He sent an urgent message to Daenerys. They had to speak once more to set aside their quarrel. They met at an abandoned sept outside the city, accompanied by a small guard each. Snow blew through the collapsed arches, swirling around broken statues of the Seven. Daenerys stood with her arms wrapped in fur, Tyrion by her side. Jon stood across from her, Davos at his. Neither Targaryen bowed. The tension was still there, but overshadowed by a new terror. Jon told her of the White Walkers' advance, the latest news of devastation. If we do not unite now, there will be no realm left to claim. Daenerys' eyes flickered with uncertainty. We have tried this before, and neither of us will yield our claim. Tyrion stepped in, his voice pleading. You speak of claims while the dead gather at our door. My queen, if this threat is as dire as he says, we must band together. The Lannisters are barricaded in the city, but if the dead arrive, even their walls won't save them. Jon took a step forward. Forget the throne for now. Let us gather our armies, meet the threat head-on. When the dead are destroyed, we can settle the question of rulership. Daenerys stared at him with a look of consideration. And how can I trust that you won't use the undead threat as a ploy to seize the city behind my back? Jon's expression was grave. I offer my word, for what it's worth. I have no desire to see the world end in ice and darkness. Tyrion interjected again, speaking softly to his queen. What good is a throne if there's no one left to rule? Silence fell, broken only by the wind that howled through the abandoned September. Daenerys and Jon locked eyes, each reflecting on the cost that might come if they refused to unite. Jon had already sacrificed his very soul in some ways. Daenerys had crossed oceans, lost a husband, risked everything for a dream of regaining her birthright. After a long moment, Daenerys nodded. "Very well. We will unite our forces, for the time being. The Lannisters cannot stand against both of us combined, and if they do not yield, we'll force them to fight with us or be destroyed. Once the dead are dealt with, we will return to this question of the throne." "Agreed." Jon hesitated, then inclined his head. "Agreed." Tyrion exhaled in relief. They had forged a fragile truce, a Targaryen alliance. The next steps moved swiftly. Jon's men and Daenerys' forces converged around King's Landing, pressing the Lannisters to join them or face oblivion when the dead arrived. The Lannisters, cornered, faced the reality that resistance meant annihilation. A reluctant truce was formed, though trust was scarce. Cersei or whichever Lannister held power in the city might plot betrayal, but for now, an uneasy cooperation set in. The combined army of men turned north to face the army of the dead. Leading them were two Targaryens, Jon, crowned in sorrow and shame, and Daenerys, the mother of dragons. They carried with them hopes and hatreds, alliances and betrayals, forging ahead through the storms of winter. Behind them, King's Landing was left in a precarious balance, guarded by minimal forces. The true test lay in the fields of the Riverlands, the snowy plains leading up to the Neck and beyond. Word of that final confrontation spread throughout Westeros, a hush of dread settling over lords and common folk alike. Was this the end of days? As they marched, Jon felt a cold emptiness where Robb's warmth had once been. He recalled the old days when the Starks were together in Winterfell. One by one, that family had been ripped apart, leaving him with a bitter crown and a bitter legacy. He wondered if, when the dead came, he would finally pay for what he had done. In the gloom of night, he sometimes dreamed of Robb's shade staring at him with accusing eyes. Sansa's words echoed in his mind, "There is always a choice." Yet if the realm survived, perhaps history would vindicate him or condemn him. The living had a chance, however slim, to unite behind two Targaryens who had every reason to hate each other. In that fragile unity, perhaps there lay hope for dawn to break upon a new age. And if dawn came, Jon knew it would illuminate a realm forever changed by the blood he had spilled, including that of the brother he loved. It would not be peace without ghosts. They pressed on into the darkness. Winter howled, snow drifted, and the fate of the Seven Kingdoms balanced on the point of a sword. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, rode at the head of an army that called him king, though he felt no joy in the honor. He was a king forged by death and betrayal. He had seized the crown the moment he struck down the king in the north, not out of greed, but because the realm demanded a single, unyielding hand. Now he carried the crown south to meet the chill of an endless night. The final test lay ahead, and only the gods would decide if his sins could be redeemed by the victory of the living, or if Westeros would be buried beneath ice and corpses, and his desperate gambit proven futile in the face of a winter that recognized no kings. Snow plastered the landscape in an unbroken sweep of white, a stark canvas against which the last living armies of Westeros moved. Beneath gray skies, the united host led by Jon, Aegon Targaryen, called the bastard dragon by some, and Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, trudged northward with grim urgency. They had struck a precarious accord outside King's Landing, an uneasy truce born of necessity rather than trust. The Lannisters, battered and cornered, had little choice but to concede at least nominal cooperation, for the alternative was annihilation at the hands of either Dragonfire or the dead. Yet the realm remained riven with distrust. Carts groaned under the weight of supplies, wheels grinding and slipping on frozen roads. Men and women alike, having marched for days through mud that turned to ice overnight, slumped in their saddles or leaned on pikes for support. The winter chill was like iron in the blood, numbing fingers and toes. The howling wind carried wordless laments and distant murmurs of discontent. Ravens flew overhead, black silhouettes against the pallid sky, their caws echoing across bleak fields. Now and again, the watchers atop tall ridges glimpsed broken farmsteads or burned-out villages, testaments either to the ravages of previous wars or to the slow advance of the undead. Near the center of the moving column, where battered knights rubbed shoulders with bowmen from the Vale, Jon rode in silence. His dark cloak, trimmed in wolf fur, was pinned with the three-headed dragon brooch that marked him king of the Seven Kingdoms by Targaryen right. ghost padded through the snow at his side, a silent specter. From time to time, the dire wolf glanced up at Jon, as if searching for some vestige of the man Ghost had once known. But Jon's eyes were distant, haunted by the memory of Robb's severed head in the great hall of Winterfell and the hush that had followed. He wondered if he had damned himself by that single stroke of Longclaw, if any forgiveness could be found for a man who had murdered his own brother, even if the brother refused to kneel, even if it was done for the sake of the realm. In those moments, the wind seemed to whisper accusations. Kinslayer, Kinslayer. It gnawed at him as surely as the cold. Sometimes he thought he felt the eyes of Arya upon him, though the girl had vanished into the winter soon after Robb's funeral. At other times, he suspected that the Northmen who marched under his banner did so with the silent hope that he might fall in battle, paying a blood debt for killing their chosen king. But when he closed his eyes, he remembered the Whites and the Night King, how unstoppable they had been at Harhome. If the realm did not unite, truly unite, humanity stood little chance of survival. A few paces behind Jon's retinue rode Ser Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight. He had become a linchpin among Jon's advisors, a seasoned man who had seen enough bloodshed to know how ephemeral mortal power could be. Davos's face was pale and drawn, though the lines of concern were often softened by empathy. He knew the burden Jon carried and tried to share it as best he could. On nights when the men camped in the ruins of some abandoned holdfast, Davos would speak gently, coaxing out Jon's thoughts, reminding him of the greater purpose behind all this horror. Yet even Davos could not dispel the guilt rooted in Jon's soul. Far ahead, the vanguard was a chaotic mix of Dothraki screamers, lightly armored Northmen, and the Unsullied. Though that might sound like a recipe for clashing cultures, the presence of dragons overhead focused minds sharply on their common goal. Daenerys Targaryen herself often flew above on Drogon, scanning the terrain for any sign of the encroaching dead. Two other dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion, soared in tandem, black silhouettes against the frosty sky. The sight of them awed many who had never believed they would lay eyes on living dragons. Some fell to their knees when Daenerys descended in a thunder of wings, convinced they were witnessing the stirrings of an ancient prophecy. Others cursed the beasts under their breath, recalling stories of Harrenhal's burning and the Mad King's cruelty. Yet no one could deny how they struck fear into the hearts of all who beheld them. Daenerys maintained a distance from Jon on most days of the march. Though they were bound by a fragile truce, they did not share the easy warmth that might exist between aunt and nephew, especially since neither had known the other existed for most of their lives. Mistrust simmered in Daenerys' eyes whenever she looked upon the man who had seized the North by killing Robb Stark. Yet necessity demanded courtesy. From time to time, she would land her dragon in a swirl of snow and speak to Jon about the road ahead, about scouting parties, about how best to deploy their combined forces against the dead. It was a dance of stiff politeness, each acknowledging the other's claim to Targaryen blood, neither willing to yield the crown. Tyrion Lannister rode with Daenerys, though for the sake of appearances, he often ventured between her column and Jon's, trying to ease tensions and coordinate strategy. He had survived many twists of fate, a fugitive from King's Landing, the cunning brain behind the rise of Daenerys Targaryen. Now his worry was that the realm's last hope might tear itself apart from within, leaving the Night King an easy victory. He found Ser Davos a willing listener, and more than once the two men conferred, trying to forestall any conflict between the Targaryen factions. The slow days of the march were haunted by rumors. Word spread that entire villages in the north had gone silent, their inhabitants either fled or slaughtered. The dead left few survivors. Some nights, men on the outskirts of the combined camp claimed they heard wailing in the distance, followed by eerie silence. Once, a patrol brought back a single White's hand, still twitching after the body it had belonged to had been burned. The grim trophy was shown to the rank and file, a demonstration of what they would face. The men did not sleep easily afterward. Eventually, the host reached the ruins of Moat Cailin. Rime clung to the stone towers, icicles dangled like teeth from the battlements, and crows caught among the shattered ramparts. The banner of House Stark once flew there, before the Boltons and the Ironborn had done their worst. Now the tattered remains of multiple sigils snapped in the harsh wind, none standing for any living army. Jon gazed at the devastation, recalling the stories of how Robb had tried to hold this vital choke point. Remnants of the battles lingered, broken spears, collapsed palisades, the bones of horses half buried in snow. The men who scouted within reported the presence of unnatural corpses, half-rotten, reanimated shapes that had either retreated or been destroyed by someone else. The place reeked of old death and black magic, as if the others had passed through and taken what they wanted. Daenerys joined Jon atop a small rise overlooking the fortress remains. The wind whipped her silver-blonde hair around her face. Drogon circled above, roaring at shadows. "If the dead are past Moat Cailin, they've reached the interior of the north," she said grimly, hugging her fur-lined cloak closer. "Will we find a single living soul left at Winterfell?" Jon's throat tightened. He remembered the grandeur of Winterfell as it was in his boyhood, warm, alive, the seat of House Stark. Then came the wars, the betrayals. "I've sent riders ahead," he replied, forcing a measure of calm into his tone. "They should return soon with news. We cannot rest long, or the dead will get even further ahead of us." Her violet eyes flicked to him, wary. "There is no time to quarrel if that's what you fear," she said. "My only aim now is to burn the whites out of this world, along with any master they serve." Jon glanced at her dragons overhead. They were formidable weapons, but he had seen how one misstep could lead to disaster. At Har Home, the Night King had brought back the dead with a simple raising of arms. The memory of that silent taunt still chilled him. Would the dragons be enough against that power? He hoped so. "We'll make a stand if we must," he said. "But it's best we engage them before they gather more numbers. The more they kill, the stronger they become." She nodded, the lines of her face set with determination. Then she reined in her horse and rode off, gathering her guard. Jon watched her go, uncertain if their alliance would hold once the Night King was beaten. If that victory was even possible. Scouts returned near dusk. Their report was bleak. Refugees scattered across the north told them that the White Walkers had indeed pushed past Moat Cailin, cutting a wide swath of death through the heart of the territory. The undead host was moving slowly but inexorably south, possibly towards the Trident or, if they maintained their direction, towards the strongholds in the Riverlands. Whether they would curve east or west next was unknown. The only surety was that any living soul caught in their path was turned or devoured. A handful of northern lords still roamed the snows, some with small warbands. Sansa Stark was rumored to have traveled south with a guard of loyal men, perhaps seeking safety in the Vale or beyond. Jon closed his eyes when he heard that. He had not spoken to Sansa since that day in Winterfell's Godswood, when she told him she hoped he would die. Now, ironically, he feared for her life more than ever. He dreaded to imagine her wandering a wasteland of the dead. He ordered a brief rest in the ruins of Moat Cailin. Fires were built with what scarce fuel they could gather. The men huddled within half-collapsed chambers and corners, stacking rubble to shield themselves from the wind. Daenerys's Dothraki patrolled the perimeter on horseback, their savage cries echoing in the night. Unsullied stood guard, silent and disciplined, as the howling gusts battered the broken walls. Dragons circled overhead, watchful. Jon walked among the men with Ghost at his side, offering what encouraging words he could muster, but they were half-frozen and sullen. Snow swirled down in relentless curtains, the moon a hazy glow above. Amid the flickering torchlight, Tyrion Lannister emerged from the gloom. His cheeks were red with cold, and he wore thick gloves and a heavy cloak of black wool. He greeted Jon with a measured nod. "Not much cheer to be found," he said, looking around at the battered soldiers. "They're exhausted, frightened, and uncertain, and with good reason." Jon knelt by a makeshift fire, turning his hands toward the flames. "They should be frightened. If we fail, the dead will sweep across all Westeros." Tyrion sighed. "You speak truly. Yet fear alone can break an army's resolve. They must also believe in something. A dream, a person, a future. And, if I might be frank, many of them only see a man who calls himself their king yet executes his own brother in the name of unity." The words struck Jon like a dull hammer. He stared into the flames, remembering the hush in Winterfell's great hall. "I deserve their mistrust," he said quietly. "Robb refused to bend. I thought it was the only way." "Perhaps it was, or perhaps not," Tyrion replied, giving him a sidelong look. "I've done terrible things myself. One can justify nearly any cruelty if the stakes are high enough. But I've come to realize that justification and absolution are seldom the same. If you're looking for a path forward, it might be wise to show these men, your new subjects, that you consider their well-being above your crown." "How?" Jon asked almost wearily. "I'm no grand seer," Tyrion said, "but a small gesture of compassion might go a long way. Ask after their families, share their hardships. Remind them of your struggles and your purpose. Show them you're not the Mad King incarnate. They need a reason to believe in you besides fear of your sword." Jon nodded, though his heart felt heavy. "I'll try," he said at last, "though I fear it's too late to undo what I've done." Tyrion gave him a sad shrug. "We all live with ghosts, your grace. That's not to let them weigh you down so heavily that you cannot walk." With that, the dwarf departed, leaving Jon alone with his thoughts and the crackling of the fire. Ghost's red eyes reflected the dancing flames. The direwolf let out a soft whine, and Jon reached to scratch his thick fur. "It's all right, boy," he murmured, though he believed no such thing. He wondered if the old gods, or the Seven, or the Lord of Light, whoever oversaw this cruel tapestry, would ever forgive him. At dawn, the columns resumed their march, forging through snowdrifts that grew deeper by the hour. They aimed for the King's Road, though winter made it nearly impassable. Jon and Daenerys hoped to intercept the Whites before they reached the densely populated areas of the Riverlands. Skirmishes soon began. Patrols encountered ragged pockets of undead, once farmers or small folk from the local villages, now Whites with ice-blue eyes. The encounters were vicious and swift, with many men falling to the unnatural strength of the dead before they managed to burn or dismember them. Through these fights, the armies learned grim lessons. The Northmen, Vale Knights, and the Dothraki soon understood the necessity of dragonglass and fire. The Unsullied proved stalwart, forming tight ranks to repel White assaults. Daenerys used her dragons to scorch larger clusters, but the creatures had to conserve energy lest they tire too quickly in the fierce cold. Even so, each clash chipped away at morale. Whites were frightening opponents, immune to pain, unstoppable unless burned or cut down by dragonglass or Valyrian steel. Men whispered of frostwhite figures glimpsed at a distance, White Walkers themselves leading small cadres of undead. The Walkers rarely engaged directly, but their presence instilled terror. Bitter stories circulated of men whose swords shattered against White Walkers' ice-forged blades, of the haunting rattle that preceded each new horde of Whites. Some insisted they heard unnatural voices in the wind. Others claimed that the Night King would soon appear astride an undead dragon, raining icy doom from above. Rumors abounded. By the time they reached a broken crossroads near the outskirts of an ancient pine forest, the combined host discovered thousands of slain men strewn across the snow, their corpses arranged in a macabre spiral pattern. Horses lay eviscerated, arms and legs had been placed in symmetrical shapes. Tyrion stared at the grisly tableau and turned pale. Daenerys, astride Drogon on a nearby hill, clenched her jaw, fury mixing with horror. It was the enemy's calling card, proof that the White Walkers toyed with the living, sending messages of fear. Jon felt a chill beyond the mere cold. He recalled how the White Walkers once left strange symbols of twisted corpses near the fist of the first men and at Hardhome. None of the men dared approach the spiral until Daenerys commanded the dragons to unleash torrents of flame. The bodies were incinerated in a roar of heat and smoke that stung the eyes. The stench of burning flesh hung in the air, nauseating. Men coughed and spat, tears freezing on their cheeks. Jon forced himself to watch, telling himself that if he ever doubted the rightness of this war, he need only remember this moment. The next day brought the first large-scale confrontation. Scouts reported that a massive host of Whites had been spotted near the ruins of a small northern keep, once known as High Point, seat of House Whitehill. The Whitehill name was a bitter one to many northerners, but that was irrelevant now. All that remained of that keep was a husk of broken walls and collapsed towers, overrun by the undead. Daenerys and Jon led their forces cautiously toward it, while the Lannister contingent, reluctantly compelled to march with them, lagged behind under the command of a lesser cousin of the family. The air smelled of ice and decay. Snow began to fall more heavily, limiting visibility. Archers climbed a ridge for vantage, but swirling gusts made it difficult to see far. Without warning, the Whites swarmed out of the ruined keep in terrifying numbers, pouring through shattered gates and over crumbled stone. Half-frozen bodies, men, women and children in ragged remains of clothing, charged forward with unnatural speed. Their shrieks chilled the blood of every living soul who heard them. At the head of the legion were monstrous silhouettes of reanimated dire wolves and bears, their fur caked in ice, eyes glowing with cold fire. Someone shouted an alarm. The horns blew in frantic blasts. Dothraki screamers galloped forth, rocks glinting with dragonglass along their edges. The unsullied formed ranks, spears bristling. Northmen hefted torches, some lit with oil, ready to fling fire at the horde. Daenerys soared above on Drogon, while Rhaegal and Viserion followed, unleashing gouts of dragon flame that incinerated dozens of whites in scalding bursts. But more and more emerged from hidden tunnels and collapsed corridors, surging toward the living lines. Jon urged his horse forward, brandishing Longclaw. Ghost bounded beside him. The clangor of steel and the roar of fire enveloped them. Each time a white fell, two more seemed to scuttle forward, jaws snapping in silent hunger. The living were forced to give ground under the sheer weight of numbers. Jon hacked at a towering white, once a bearded Northman, cleaving it diagonally. Its body collapsed, thrashing in the snow until a nearby soldier doused it with flaming oil. The stench of charred flesh was overwhelming. Arrows rained down from the ridge, many tipped with dragonglass. Whites collapsed, pinned to the ground or severed of limbs, but their fellows swarmed over them. Daenerys's dragons circled overhead, exhaling plumes of flame, scorching entire swathes of the battlefield. The heat radiated across the snow, melting it into slush, but the night's chill swiftly refroze it, turning the ground into a treacherous mess of mud and ice. The Dothraki, for all their ferocity, struggled to keep formation in the slick terrain. Several horses lost their footing, falling beneath scrabbling undead hands. Jon fought his way toward a vantage point of fallen masonry that jutted like a broken fong. He scaled it, leaping from block to block, using his vantage to call out orders. Below him, Ser Davos rallied the wavering lines, urging them to hold. The Unsullied closed ranks around the left flank, pikes braced. The Vale Knights, though less numerous, crashed into pockets of whites with disciplined charges, trying to chop through. But the numbers seemed endless. A bone-chilling horn blast echoed through the swirling snow, and Jon saw them, pale figures garbed in icy armor, their eyes glowing an unearthly blue. White walkers, astride dead horses, emerged from the keep's courtyard. One brandished a spear of ice that gleamed even in the dim light. Another carried a sword that seemed to shimmer with each swirl of frost. They looked upon the chaos with eerie composure. As soon as Jon's gaze met theirs, a dreadful tremor passed through him, recalling the time he had crossed blades with one at Castle Black. He remembered how the creature's sword had shattered normal steel. Only Valyrian steel or dragonglass stood a chance. Before Jon could leap down to engage them, a rush of wing beats overhead signaled Daenerys' approach. Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame, bathing the courtyard. The White Walker with the spear hurled it with inhuman strength. The weapon soared through the air, trailing an icy mist. Jon's heart lurched. He remembered the stories of the Night King felling a dragon with a single throw. But this time, Daenerys wheeled Drogon sharply aside and the spear missed by a hair. It crashed into the far side of the courtyard, encasing stone in a web of crackling ice. Daenerys roared a command, the dragon banked, and flame rained upon the courtyard, driving whites to cinders. One White Walker vanished in the conflagration, shrieking with an otherworldly screech. As the dragonfire consumed it, the other spurred its undead horse away, trailing frost. For a moment, the tide of whites faltered as if the partial destruction of their leadership disrupted them. Seizing that opening, Jon leapt down from the rubble, Ghost at his side. He cut through a pair of whites scrabbling at an injured knight, then saw the White Walker that had fled deeper into the rubble. Its horse was gone, left behind, but the creature stood in a half-collapsed archway, glaring at Jon with baleful blue eyes. Frost crystals swirled around it. In its hands, the shimmering ice sword glowed with lethal promise. Jon advanced, Longclaw held in both hands. Each breath condensed in frigid puffs. The White Walker hissed, brandishing its blade. Jon lunged, driving Longclaw forward. The walker parried with a sharp twist that sent sparks of blue ice dancing. Shards of frost flaked from the walker's weapon, yet it did not shatter against Valyrian steel. With graceful speed, the walker spun and slashed. Jon barely twisted aside in time. A second slash shattered a chunk of the archway behind him, sending icy rubble raining down. Ghost lunged, snarling, but the walker kicked out with supernatural force, hurling the direwolf back into a broken wall. Jon pressed in again, scoring a glancing blow across the walker's torso. A wisp of frosty vapor trailed from the wound, and it hissed and raged. The clash was a blur of steel and ice. Jon felt each impact reverberate through his arms, a painful numbness creeping into his fingers from the cold that emanated off the walker. The creature's face was a mask of malevolence, as if it took some pleasure in toying with its mortal foe. At last, Jon parried a powerful overhead strike and drove his pommel into the walker's chest, knocking it off balance. Longclaw swept up in a lethal arc, biting deep into its torso. For a heartbeat, the walker's eyes flared an intense blue, its mouth opening in a silent wail. Then it burst apart into 1,000 shards of ice, collapsing to the ground in a fine powder that sparkled in the feeble daylight. Exhaling raggedly, Jon staggered back. Ghost rose, limping slightly but otherwise unhurt. Jon rested a hand on the direwolf's flank, relief and exhaustion mingling in his mind. Killing a White Walker was no small feat, but there were countless more out there, and even mightier foes. He could hear the raging battle just beyond the rubble. Returning to the main courtyard, Jon discovered that Daenerys's dragons had routed a large portion of the undead. Flaming rubble littered the area. The stench of burning corpses was almost unbearable. Yet hundreds of whites still clashed with the living. Step by step, the allied forces pressed the dead back into the crumbling remains of the keep, burning them wherever they could. Rhaegal and Viserion pummeled the ruins with searing gouts of flame, collapsing walls and towers onto the horde below. The White Walkers had vanished, save for the one Daenerys had destroyed and the one Jon had just slain, which gave the living a chance to regroup. Eventually, the dead were cornered in the ruined Great Hall of High Point, a collapsed section of stone that Daenerys and her dragons bombarded until the entire structure caved in, burying the writhing whites under tons of rock. Soldiers with torches and pitch rushed forward to set everything ablaze. Through acrid smoke, the living coughed and stumbled, some retching from the fumes. The day's victory had come at a terrible price. Bodies of men and horses lay scattered across the courtyard, many partially devoured. Dozens of survivors had been bitten or scratched, and though white infection did not spread like the diseases of normal men, the fear of turning was strong. Jon and Daenerys had triumphed here, but it was a small triumph at best, and the dead had no need to rest or mourn their losses. Wherever the Night King was, he would be gathering more corpses for his army. In the aftermath, Daenerys dismounted to survey the carnage. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair plastered to her cheeks by sweat and melted snow. She encountered Jon amid the rubble. For a moment, they merely looked at each other, exhaustion and wariness in both gazes. Drogon landed behind her, folding his wings with a thunderous flap. Jon's men eyed the beast warily, though it had spared them so far. "You slew a White Walker," Daenerys said at last, her breath misting in the frigid air. "I saw the shards of it." Jon nodded, wiping blood from his brow. "I did. And you burned one." She gave a curt nod in return. "It seems we can hurt them in more ways than one." "That's good." Her eyes flicked over the scorched remains. "Though there are many more out there. Do we push north again, or stay and fortify?" Jon hesitated, glancing at the faces of those around him, exhausted men and women, their eyes filled with horror and fatigue. "We should push on, but the army needs rest. A night or two at most, unless we want them too weak to fight when the next horde arrives." A flicker of frustration tightened Daenerys' features, but she did not press. She, too, understood the toll. "Very well," she said quietly. "We camp here, gather what supplies can be salvaged from the local area. I'll have Grey Worm post double sentries. The Whites strike at night as readily as day." Jon inclined his head, grateful for her agreement. "I'll see to the wounded," he said. "And the funeral pyres." She moved to speak but paused as if uncertain how to address him. "I will have the dragons patrol the perimeter," she murmured instead, turning to walk away. Over her shoulder, she said, "You fought well, Aegon Targaryen. It would seem your skill is as formidable as your resolve." He sensed the reference to what he had done in Winterfell. Perhaps in her own way, she acknowledged that the same ruthless resolve he'd shown Robb was the resolve with which he now fought the dead. He watched her go, a swirl of ash drifting around her boots. Drogon followed, snarling at anyone who ventured too close. Jon pushed aside the twisting pang in his gut and turned his focus to the wounded, directing some to set up makeshift shelters where the tower's walls still stood. Grim-faced maesters and healers among the combined forces labored to save who they could. Jon moved among them, rolling up his sleeves to help carry the injured to cover. The men watched him warily, some flinching from his presence. Others lowered their eyes, the memory of Winterfell's tragedy still raw. He recalled Tyrion's advice, show them you care for something beyond the crown. So he tried, bandaging cuts, offering water, speaking gently when a soldier's eyes brimmed with tears at the loss of a comrade. His presence calmed a few, though not all. Trust was a fragile thing, and the spectacle of him kneeling by a wounded man's side did not erase the memory of the great hall's bloodshed. Still, he persevered. Night fell swiftly, accompanied by howling winds that threatened to snuff out torches. The Allied armies lit great bonfires in the courtyard to dispose of their dead, ensuring none would rise again. Smoke drifted up in thick plumes. Everywhere, men and women coughed, their throats raw from the acrid fumes. Jon stood near one pyre, watching the flames dance. He thought of those who had died under his command, men he had never met but whose lives he had claimed responsibility for the moment he demanded they bend the knee. Did they forgive him? Did Robb? Weary beyond measure, he retreated to a small corner of collapsed stone to snatch what rest he could. The sound of the wind rattling through empty windows lulled him into a troubled sleep. He dreamt of Winterfell's great hall, the echoes of Sansa's screams, and the moment-long loss sliced through Robb's neck. In the dream, Robb's head turned to face him, lips parting in a silent accusation. Jon woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, guilt flooding him anew. Outside, the night stretched on. At dawn, they marched again, though the men trudged with leaden limbs. The deeper they pressed into the north, the more devastation they found. Villages lay in ruins, farms abandoned. Occasionally they encountered small groups of survivors, families huddling in hidden cellars, or a few ragged men who had taken to the woods. Most of these refugees looked upon the Targaryen banners with as much fear as relief, uncertain what fate awaited them. Jon ordered that they be given shelter and instruction that Daenerys did not contest. In truth, they needed every living body capable of wielding a dragonglass blade. Word came that Sansa Stark had been spotted near the last hearth, seat of House Umber, apparently leading a motley band of survivors. The news jolted Jon. She had traveled far to the north, deeper into danger? It made little sense. Some said she had gone to retrieve something from the ancestral lands of the Starks or to search for her youngest brother, Rickon, though Rickon had been reported dead at the hands of Ramsay Bolton in some accounts. Others speculated she was simply fleeing anywhere that was not under Jon's dominion, refusing to kneel to the man who killed Robb. Jon wrestled with a desperate urge to break off from the main force and find Sansa, but the needs of the war prevented such a choice. Instead, he sent loyal Northmen to track her down, hoping they might bring her back safely. Whether she would come willingly was another question. As the Allied host pushed on, winter intensified. Snowfalls seemed to devour entire days, forcing the armies to struggle through waist-high drifts, with scouts on skis trying to find a passable route. Many men froze to death during the night, discovered stiff and blue in the morning. Horses perished by the hundreds, unable to forage. Daenerys found that even her dragons suffered, their roars of discomfort echoing across bleak plains. The entire campaign slowed to a crawl, giving the undead more time to spread. At times, it seemed as if the North would kill them before the dead even arrived. During these grim marches, Jon and Daenerys had little time to quarrel. Necessity bound them more tightly than any vow. Tyrion, Ser Davos, Missandei, Grey Worm, and the other leaders worked frantically to keep their forces fed, clothed, and armed. The Vale Knights scoured the countryside for hidden storehouses. The Dothraki hunted whatever game still roamed. Lannister foragers, uneasy among Northerners who hated them, nonetheless contributed to the overall stockpile. Winter forced cooperation in a manner that no negotiation alone could have accomplished. Weeks passed in a haze of cold and desperation. Skirmishes with the Whites flared sporadically, each one whittling down the living. The White Walkers were rarely seen, flitting at the edges of vision, testing the Allied lines. The men's nerves frayed, some deserted, slipping off into the wilderness, never to be heard from again. Others turned to feral superstition, offering blood sacrifices to weirwood trees in hopes of appeasing ancient gods. The dragons remained a beacon of awe and fear. When Daenerys sent them to torch pockets of undead, morale soared, but it was never enough. The night always brought more horrors. Finally, as if drawn by the relentless swirl of fate, the combined host converged with the main body of the dead near a ruined fortress once known as Torrhen's Square. Reports indicated that the Night King himself led the horde there, commanding an army of tens of thousands of whites, along with numerous White Walkers. The living forces rallied on a broad plain outside the fortress. Snowdrifts reached knee-height, broken by patches of blackened earth. The ruin of Torrhen Square loomed behind the undead host, its walls battered from previous wars. Now it served as a ghoulish staging ground for the White Walkers. When Jon beheld the scale of the dead ranks, a chill deeper than any winter wind seized him. The Whites stretched out in lines so vast they resembled an endless sea of ashen faces, many still clad in rotted armor or the tattered remains of their mortal garb. Eyes of icy blue glittered in the pale daylight. The White Walkers rode among them like lords of frost, their breath turning the air to glittering shards. And at the center, astride a massive undead horse that snorted plumes of cold mist, was the Night King, tall, slender, crowned with cruel ridges of ice. His expression was a mask of ancient malevolence, as if carved from a glacier eons ago. Some men whispered that he had once been the first of the Night's Watch, corrupted by the children of the forest. Others claimed he was something older still, a primal embodiment of winter's wrath. Daenerys landed Drogon a short distance away, with Rhaegal and Viserion flanking them overhead. The allied leaders convened on the slope of a windswept hill where their banners flew, Targaryen black and red, side by side with the standards of the Vale, the few Northman houses that remained loyal, a smattering of Lannister lions, and the flags of the Dothraki Khalasar. Each banner fluttered in the biting gusts, overshadowed by the knowledge that they faced a cataclysm that could end all banners forever. Tyrion's face was pale as he surveyed the undead ranks. "Gods be good," he breathed. "Even with dragons, our chances seem slim." Davos, cradling a dragonglass-tipped spear, nodded grimly. "We do our duty. That's all there is." Daenerys, standing tall despite the cold, squared her shoulders. "We burn them all," she declared. Her voice carried a fierce ring, though her hands trembled slightly. "If the Night King shows himself, I will annihilate him with dragonfire." Jon's gaze lingered on the Night King in the distance. He recalled Har Home, the memory seared into his mind, that silent, mocking gesture. He clenched his jaw. "We aim for him," Jon agreed, voice tight. "Slay the Night King, and the Whites collapse. At least that is what we've been told by Bran, by those who know the old stories. We must be ready for anything." They drew up their plan swiftly. Daenerys and her dragons would attempt to reach the Night King by air, unleashing dragon fire. The allied infantry, including the Unsullied, Vale Knights, Northmen, and Dothraki, would form a crescent to funnel the dead into a killing ground. Mobile flanks led by cavalry and small squads armed with dragonglass-laden scorpions would target White Walkers. Archers would stand at the rear, loosing volleys of dragonglass arrows. Jon, armed with long claw, would move with the center, coordinating the defense and ready to join Daenerys if she needed ground support. It was a gamble, but there was no time for a more cunning strategy. Winter was at its peak, and the dead were legion. The armies arrayed themselves on that plain, the living beating drums in a deliberate rhythm to steady nerves. One by one, men embraced each other, whispered prayers, or drew tokens of faith, seven-pointed stars, carved weirwood tokens, lumps of black obsidian. The howling wind carried the stench of decay from the undead ranks, which stood in eerie silence, awaiting the command of the Night King. It began with a single roar. Drogon launched into the sky, followed by Rhaegal and Viserion. Daenerys, astride Drogon's spined back, guided him forward in a powerful sweep of wing beats. The thunder of dragons spurred the allied lines into motion. War horns blared. The Dothraki surged, aurochs glinting with faint sunlight on the dragonglass edges. Northmen and Vale Knights raised spears and swords, bellowing cries of defiance. Jon advanced on foot at the forefront, Ghost bounding at his side, his breath pluming in white clouds. Then the dead began to move. At a silent command from the Night King, they surged forward in a relentless, fleshless tide, hands outstretched, jaws gaping. Their discordant shrieks tore at the minds of living foes. Whole swarms of them advanced as one, tripping over one another but never faltering, driven by an unholy will. They clashed with the Dothraki screamers in an explosion of steel and hooves. The Dothraki, for all their fierceness, were soon swallowed in a mass of bodies. Torches and flaming aurochs flashed in the gloom, but it was impossible to see who was winning. The ground shook with the tumult. Overhead, the dragons breathed fire upon the undead. Columns of flame incinerated hundreds at a time, reducing them to blackened husks. The shrieks of dying whites filled the air, but just as many poured in from the flanks, scuttling over their burned brethren like insects. The crescent line of Unsullied locked shields, stabbing forward with dragonglass spears in disciplined formations. The Vale Knights, on horseback, attempted to sweep around the edges, cutting down Whites from the rear. But White Walkers emerged, stoic and menacing, to counter each maneuver, their ice weapons gleaming. Men fell screaming as their steel shattered or their flesh froze at the touch of those unholy blades. Jon flung himself into the thick of the fray, Longclaw flashing with each strike. He knew that White's could be cut down easily enough, provided he avoided being overwhelmed. A slash severed a White's arm, another took off its head. Men all around him did the same. Fire arrows soared overhead, flickering in the snowy sky. Occasional gusts of wind snuffed them out, leaving them to fall uselessly. The moans and shrieks of the dead became a hideous chorus. High above, Daenerys spied the Night King. He sat upon his undead horse, still as ice, watching the slaughter from a slight rise. She urged Drogon forward, narrowing her eyes. She loosed a furious wave of fire that cascaded down. But the Night King raised his arms and some uncanny frost enveloped him, diverting the worst of the flame. Though the ground around him crackled and sizzled, he emerged unscathed, his expression unmoved. Daenerys cursed, circling for another pass. Below, the swirling chaos intensified. Jon found himself separated from the main body of his men, stranded amid half-collapsed stones. A wave of Whites rushed at him. He cut them down in a flurry of blows, but more came. Ghost leapt onto the back of a reanimated giant that lumbered forward, ripping at its icy flesh. The giant roared soundlessly, thrashing. Ghost was flung aside, yelping. A lesser man might have fled, but Jon faced the towering creature head-on. He slashed at its ankles, severing half-rotted sinew, toppling it to one knee. Then he drove Longclaw into the base of its skull. The giant collapsed in a cloud of snow and dust. Jon stumbled back, panting, searching for Ghost. The direwolf was shaken but alive, struggling to rise from a mound of corpses. He glimpsed a White Walker approaching, pale hair trailing like a veil of frost. Its sword shimmered with sickly blue light. Weary though he was, Jon braced himself, calling upon what remained of his strength to fight. But at that moment, a spear whistled past his shoulder, piercing the walker clean through. It exploded into icy shards with a screech. Jon whipped around to see Ser Davos still clutching a battered dragonglass-tipped spear. Davos gave him a grim nod, then moved on, helping another soldier who was beset by Whites. Jon exhaled relief and continued the slaughter. Across the battlefield, Tyrion sheltered with a group of archers, loosing arrow after arrow, each tipped with dragonglass. His brow was slick with sweat despite the cold. "Steady!" he yelled, voice straining to be heard over the din. "Aim for the walkers if you see them." The archers were terrified, seeing friends dragged down by skeletal hands, hearing the snap of bones. Tyrion refused to let them flee, rallying them with curses and appeals to their survival. Each arrow found a target, though it felt like bailing water from a sinking ship. Dean. Aerys made a second pass at the Night King. This time, she descended so Drogon's flames would strike him at point-blank range. The conflagration was immense, turning Whites around him to ash in an instant, scorching the ground black. For a moment, all was hidden in flame and shadow. Then, from within that blaze, a spear of ice sailed upward, forcing Drogon to veer aside. The tip of the spear missed the dragon's main body, but it tore across Drogon's flank, slicing scales and drawing a roar of pain. Daenerys clutched at Drogon's spines as he lurched. Blood, hot and steaming, poured from the wound, hissing in the snow. She cursed again, guiding her wounded dragon away from the Night King's lethal aim. The momentum of the fight was shifting. Meanwhile, Rhaegal and Viserion rained fire on the undead lines. One soared too low, and Whites leapt onto its hindquarters, clawing at the dragon's scales with frenzied desperation. The dragon bucked, whipping its tail, flinging them off, but not before some had torn into its flesh. The living roared in dismay. The Night King, seeing an opportunity, seemed to gesture, and White Walkers advanced in that area, pressing the allied line further. Jon realized that if they did not kill the Night King soon, the living would be overrun. He forced his way through the crush of Whites, urging men around him to rally. "To me," he cried, voice cracking from strain. "Push them back." The half-frozen knights responded, hacking at the undead with renewed vigor. Together, they carved a path toward the slight rise where the Night King surveyed the battle. Then the ground began to rumble. An unearthly cry split the air, high and keening like the shriek of a damned soul. From the crumbling courtyard of Torrens Square emerged a monstrous shape, a dragon, once living but now undead. Its scales gleamed with frost, its eyes burning with a terrible blue glow. Torn wings flapped, stirring clouds of snow. Men cried out in horror. This was the beast many had feared the Night King might possess. Indeed, for the first time, the Night King dismounted from his undead horse and vaulted into the saddle of the undead dragon, which lowered its spined neck for him. A hush of dread spread across the battlefield. The undead dragon spread its tattered wings and took flight, ascending into the tempestuous sky. Ice crystals trailed from its wounds, and its roar was like the shattering of 1,000 glaciers. The Night King guided it over the living lines, and a blast of pale fire erupted from its jaws, fire that burned cold, forming jagged ice where it struck. Men screamed as the freezing flame devoured them, leaving contorted corpses. Where normal dragon fire could incinerate, this unnatural flame froze and shattered. Entire ranks of Northmen and Unsullied were lost in moments. Daenerys, seeing this horror, spurred Drogon upward, ignoring the dragon's bleeding flank. Rhaegal and Viserion joined her, each letting out a furious roar. The three living dragons converged on the undead beast in a whirling dance of wings and wrath. High above the battlefield, dragon fought dragon, shrieking and tearing with claws and teeth. The Night King, perched in the undead dragon's saddle of ice, hurled shards at his foes, narrowly missing Daenerys' head. The sky became a swirling melee of flame and frost. Below, the allied lines wavered. Whites pressed relentlessly. Jon realized that if Daenerys could keep the undead dragon occupied, perhaps he could reach the Night King on foot, but now the Night King was high in the air, beyond the reach of any normal blade. Furious at the situation, Jon continued to carve through whites, heading for a vantage point. He glimpsed a piece of shattered rampart from Torrhen Square, a tall chunk of stone that might serve. Signaling to a handful of men, he fought his way toward it, hoping to climb and perhaps throw a spear or arrow. It seemed mad, but desperation drove him. Ghosts snarled at his heels, ripping apart whites that tried to flank them. The ground was strewn with the dead again. Arrows whistled overhead, scorpions fired bolts of dragonglass at White Walkers. The chaos was indescribable. Time lost meaning. War cries, shrieks of the dying, the flutter of burning banners all blurred into an endless nightmare. Suddenly, a swirl of motion drew Jon's eye. Daenerys had engaged the undead dragon at close quarters. Drogon latched onto its flank with massive claws, raking and tearing. Rhaegal circled overhead, unleashing jets of flame. The undead beast responded by spewing its icy breath, freezing Drogon's left wing in a crackling sheath. Drogon howled in agony, losing altitude. The Night King stood on the undead dragon's back, arms raised. He focused an unholy power downward, and to Jon's horror, hundreds of slain men and horses began to stir anew, fresh whites rising in the midst of the allied lines. The advantage of the living vanished in an instant as new foes erupted from within their ranks. Jon realized with terrible clarity that the living might lose here and now. The lines were fractured, men turning in shock as their fallen comrades rose up to kill them. The only hope remained in the Night King's death. Jon spotted a scorpion loaded with a dragonglass-tipped bolt near the broken rampart, its crew half slaughtered by whites. Perhaps that was their chance. He bellowed for the men with him to clear the area, pushing away the whites that pawed at the scorpion's supports. They rammed torches and swords into the undead. Jon himself decapitated 2 whites that clung to the scorpion's operator. Then they righted the siege weapon, rotating it to aim skyward. Atop the swirling melee of dragons, the Night King parted his lips in a silent snarl, raising another spear of ice. He hurled it toward Rhaegal, who tried to dodge. The spear caught the dragon's flank, piercing deep. Rhaegal roared in pain, wings faltering as he plummeted. Men scattered below to avoid the crashing beast. Rhaegal struck the ground in a thunderous impact, sending up clouds of snow and earth. Jon's heart lurched. Another dragon was wounded. Daenerys circled Drogon around, pushing the undead beast away from the fallen Rhaegal. Viserion, shrieking, dived in to support its sibling, drawing the undead dragon's attention. "Load it!" Jon shouted, pointing to the scorpion. A trembling soldier rammed the dragonglass-tipped bolt into place, while another cranked the tension. They aimed at the Night King, who circled overhead on the undead dragon, preparing another spear. The swirling aerial battle made it nearly impossible to get a clear shot. The scorpion's operator lined up as best he could, hands shaking with cold and terror. Jon watched the sky, waiting for a moment when the undead dragon held steady. Then, an opening. The undead dragon pivoted to unleash its icy breath upon Rhaegal, who lay wounded, pinned by its own weight. The Night King, arms raised, ready to final blow. "Now!" Jon yelled. The soldier released the scorpion's lever. The dragonglass bolt streaked upward, slicing through the air with lethal velocity. At the last instant, the undead dragon twisted, sensing danger. The bolt missed the Night King by a hand's breadth, but it struck the undead dragon's neck, embedding itself near the shoulder. A shriek of rage exploded from the beast. It thrashed and bucked, nearly unseating the Night King. Icy flames spewed wildly, freezing the air in chaotic bursts. Daenerys, seizing the moment, dove Drogon onto the undead dragon's back, tearing at its wings with savage fury. The Night King shifted, trying to maintain balance, but the force of Drogon's impact knocked him loose. He tumbled from the undead dragon's back, plummeting toward the courtyard in a swirl of ice. His fall ended in a crash amid the broken stones below, fragments of masonry spraying outward. At once, the allied forces that remained near that courtyard rallied, surging toward him. The undead around him protected their master, forming a writhing shield of bodies. Whites threw themselves in front of the living, sacrificing themselves to buy the Night King a moment. He rose unbroken, though cracked ice patterns shimmered across his form. His gaze burned with ancient malice. Daenerys, overhead, ordered Drogon to bathe him in flame once more. Yet before the inferno struck, the Night King thrust out his hands and conjured an icy vortex that deflected much of the dragonfire. The ground around him melted, but he stood untouched. The white-hot flames swirled into steam and drifted away. Jon saw his chance. If he could close the distance, Longclaw might finish what they had begun. He roared for the men around him to clear a path. Together, they hammered through the ring of whites, though each step came at a cost. Jon felt claws rake his arm, teeth snapping at his cloak. He shoved them back, swung Longclaw in wide arcs, cleaving limbs and torsos. Ghost tore out the throat of a reanimated soldier. The stench of rot filled Jon's nostrils. He forced himself onward, boots slipping in slush and gore, until at last the ring broke and he beheld the Night King, standing alone at the center of a widening circle. The ground hissed with leftover steam, and a swirl of snow drifted between them. The undead dragon, gravely wounded by the scorpion bolt and Drogon's assault, careened overhead in an erratic flight. Daenerys circled, battered but still astride Drogon. Rhaegal lay wounded nearby, Viserion swooping protectively overhead. The living and the dead had parted, forming an arena of sorts around Jon and the Night King. The Watchers dared not intervene, for the power unleashed here was too great. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of burning corpses, the distant moans of whites, and the roar of the wind. Jon met the Night King's gaze. It was a stare as empty as the heart of winter, yet brimming with ancient malevolence. Holding Longclaw ready, Jon advanced cautiously. He remembered the time at Harhome, how the Night King had defied him with that silent challenge. Now at last, they would resolve it. The Night King lifted a long blade of ice, intricate runes etched into its surface. Frost crackled over the ground where he stepped. Jon lunged, swinging Longclaw in a diagonal slash. The Night King parried with impossible speed. The clash of Valyrian steel and ice reverberated in the air, sending up sparks that shimmered oddly, half like frost and half like steel. Jon pressed, recalling his training, his duels, the lessons hammered into him at Castle Black. But the Night King moved with inhuman grace, each strike time to test Jon's defenses from a new angle. Ice spread wherever the Night King's blade touched, leaving a thin rime on Longclaw itself. Jon had to twist away, ignoring the burn in his muscles, refusing to yield. Around them, men and whites paused to witness the confrontation. Some among the living shouted encouragement. Others were too terrified to speak. Daenerys hovered on Drogon, wanting to help but knowing a blast of dragon fire might engulf Jon too. Tyrion, from far behind the lines, watched with heart pounding in his throat. Davos stood with a cluster of battered Northmen, muttering desperate prayers. Any interference might break Jon's focus, yet if they stood idle and Jon fell, all hope would be lost. The Night King brought his blade down in a vicious overhead strike. Jon raised Longclaw to block. The impact jarred him to the bone, forcing him to a knee. Ice bloomed across his sword's guard, creeping toward his hands. He growled, channeling all his will into pushing the Night King back. With a desperate surge, he threw the creature off, sprang to his feet, and slashed horizontally. The tip of Longclaw raked the Night King's chest, leaving a crack in his icy armor. A sound like a distant thunder emanated from the wound, but the Night King showed no sign of pain. Jon's heart thundered. He tried to press the advantage, driving the Night King back. Another slash, then a thrust. The Night King parried, stepping aside with uncanny fluidity. Jon's blade skimmed the creature's ribs, chipping off ice. The Night King's eyes flared with a wrathful glow. He feinted high, then slashed low, a maneuver that caught Jon off guard. Pain ripped through Jon's leg. He cried out as the cold blade cut deep. Only his thick breeches and quick reflexes kept his limb from being severed. He stumbled, dropping to one knee. The Night King seized the moment to punch him across the face with a fist like frozen steel. Stars exploded behind Jon's eyes. He tasted blood, felt the world tilt. Longclaw nearly fell from his grip, but he clung to it with white-knuckled determination. Ghost howled, leaping at the Night King, but the creature twisted, swinging its blade. In a heartbeat, Ghost was struck down, the blade glancing off his flank. The dire wolf tumbled away, yelping. Jon roared in anguish, forcing himself upright despite the agony in his leg. He slashed wildly, the blow arcing with the last of his strength. The Night King caught it, locked blades with Jon for one suspended moment. Jon's breath clouded between them. He thought of Robb, of Sansa, of Bran and Arya, of every sacrifice that had led him to this moment. Mustering every ounce of will, Jon yanked back Longclaw slightly, then drove forward in a thrust aimed for the Night King's shattered chest. The movement caught the creature off balance. The Valyrian steel sank into the crack with a keening wail. The Night King's eyes blazed a furious blue-white, flaring so brightly that Jon had to shut his own. The creature tried to strike Jon's throat, but the motion faltered. As if the energies that held him together were unraveling, the Night King froze in place, trembling. Then he exploded into shards of ice, a blizzard of fragments that swirled around Jon like a collapsing glacier. In that final cataclysmic moment, an unearthly roar tore through the battlefield. The Whites, each one connected to the Night King's will, spasmed and crumpled. White Walkers still standing shattered in place, their icy forms disintegrating as though a unifying force had been severed. The undead dragon, locked in aerial combat with Viserion, roared once in defiance and then burst into cold shards that rained down across the plain, leaving only blackened bones. The entire legion of the dead collapsed. An echoing hush descended, broken only by the wind keening over the corpses. Jon stood, trembling, in the circle of steaming snow, his leg burning with pain, blood trickling from his mouth. Around him, the living gazed in shocked wonder as the Whites crumbled to lifeless corpses or dissolved into frosty dust. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then a ragged cheer arose. Men raised their swords, weeping with relief and triumph. Some sank to their knees, offering thanks to gods old and new. Tyrion exhaled a laugh that was half sob, leaning on a broken spear. Davos wept openly, tears freezing on his cheeks. Daenerys, still astride Drogon overhead, gazed at Jon with a complicated mixture of awe and recognition, as if finally acknowledging the unimaginable role he had played. Even the dragons roared triumph in unison. Jon slumped forward, leaning on Longclaw to keep from collapsing. Ghost limped to his side, whimpering. Jon knelt to check the direwolf's wound, tears burning his eyes. Ghost was bleeding, but alive, his flank gouged. Jon whispered comforting words, his throat tight with emotion. Perhaps, he thought, none of this was worth the pain inflicted, the horrors endured. But the realm still stood. They had won, or at least survived, this final battle of ice and death. The allied armies, battered and broken, began to gather around the circle. Some men fell to their knees in front of Jon as though he were some divine figure. Others simply stared at him with weary respect, having witnessed a miracle. Jon raised his head and saw Daenerys descending on Drogon. Her expression was unreadable. The moment Drogon's claws touched the snow, she slid from his back, ignoring the dragon's pained grumbles. Blood still seeped from Drogon's flank, steaming on the snow. She crossed the distance to Jon, stepping over bodies and shattered weapons. He rose unsteadily, favoring his wounded leg. Their gazes locked. Daenerys offered a hand which Jon accepted out of reflex. Together, they stood at the center of the field of corpses, the hush deep and profound. She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. "You saved us," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "You killed him." Jon shook his head, feeling hollow. "We all did," he murmured. "You, the dragons, everyone." He swallowed, the taste of blood still on his tongue. "It's done." Daenerys' eyes flickered with emotion. She might have embraced him, might have declared him a hero before all. But something held her back, perhaps the knowledge that their rivalry for the throne remained unresolved. Instead, she inclined her head, a gesture of respect. "We live," she said. "For now." Those two words hung between them like a promise and a warning. The future remained uncertain. The dead were gone, but the living had not yet decided how to rule themselves. Battered, grieving, and exhausted, the Allied forces began the grim task of tending the wounded, collecting the dead for pyres, salvaging what they could from the battlefield. Frozen corpses, once whites, now truly lifeless, lay in heaps. White Walker shards melted into slush, leaving behind fragments of strange ice that quickly turned to water. The reek of death clung to every gust of wind. Jon limped through the carnage, ignoring the sharp throbbing in his leg, offering what assistance he could. Davos hurried to his side, pressing a cloth to his bleeding face. Tyrion approached, eyes bright with relief, stammering thanks. At length, Jon found a place to sit, a chunk of masonry near the collapsed walls of Torrhen Square, while a field medic bound his leg wound. The man's hands were swift but not gentle, and Jon bit back a groan. Every part of him ached, but it was a living ache. As he sat there, men approached in ones and twos, offering quiet words of gratitude or veneration. Some bent the knee, muttering titles that felt foreign to his ears: Your Grace, King Aegon Targaryen, the savior of the realm. He wanted none of it. He thought of Robb, of Sansa, of the promises he had broken. Had it all been necessary? Or had he damned himself for a realm now delivered from the dead? The question had no easy answer, but he felt the emptiness at his core, the ache that went beyond flesh. Victory could not resurrect the people he had lost. The realm breathed, but it was changed forever, broken and bruised like him. Later, as the pyres were lit, sending pillars of smoke into the reddening twilight, Jon forced himself to stand. His wound burned. Blood still stained his clothes. But he had to see the remains of the man he had once been. He strode alone through the aftermath, stepping carefully over the bodies of men and beasts alike. Ghost followed at a distance, as if sensing Jon's turmoil. When he reached the edge of a large pyre, he paused. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows across his face. He recalled the ghosts of the crypts at Winterfell, the day he had learned of his parentage. He recalled the hush in the great hall when he delivered Robb's sentence. Everything had led him here. A swirl of ash drifted by, carried on the wind. Jon stared into the pyre and whispered, "I'm sorry," though he knew not if those words were meant for Robb, Sansa, or the entire realm. Perhaps all of them. The pyre crackled, cinders floating skyward, fading into the darkening sky. Daenerys appeared beside him, silent as a shadow. She too had changed this day, her dragons wounded, her followers reduced. A subtle sadness tinged her regal bearing. She took a breath, and for a moment Jon thought she might speak of the future, of the Iron Throne, of which Targaryen claim should stand. But she only said, in a voice weighed with sorrow, "The dead are gone. We remain." Jon nodded once, letting the words sink in. "We remain," he echoed. They stood there, side by side in the swirling ash and firelit gloom. Two Targaryens who had endured unimaginable horrors to preserve a realm that might now have to face the question of who should truly rule. But at least there was a realm left to argue over. In that tenuous moment, no crowns mattered, no banners, no talk of fealty. They had survived the long night. The rest could wait for tomorrow. Across the battlefield, men continued to cheer in broken voices, or weep over comrades who would never rise. Tyrion and Davos conferred about what supplies might remain. The dragons lay curled together, wounded but alive, their breath steaming in the bitter cold. Flakes of snow drifted lazily through the rising smoke, a faint hush settling over the plain as the final moans of the dying faded. Night came, but this time it felt like any other night in winter, not an endless void of darkness. The stars emerged, scattered across the sky, faint glimmers of hope amidst the blackness. Jon and Daenerys both knew that the world had changed irrevocably. The threat of the White Walkers was ended, though at what cost? Jon carried the weight of countless sins, the memory of a brother's blood spilled by his own hand, the burden of a realm forcibly united. Daenerys, too, bore the scars of her conquests and the knowledge that her claim to the throne was contested by the very man who had saved them all. Yet for one silent hour, neither spoke of crowns or rivalries. The hush that accompanied the swirling snow and dying fires was enough. The realm lived. Winter would pass eventually. And when dawn broke on the morrow, they would face the new storms of mortal politics, the question of succession, the anger of lords who remembered Targaryen tyranny, the sorrow of Northmen who had lost their king and held Jon accountable. But for tonight, they were simply survivors of the Great War. Two Targaryens in a land that had nearly succumbed to death, forging a fragile kinship in the ashes of victory. Outside the flicker of pyres, beyond the hush of exhausted soldiers, the winter winds carried a low howl. Not the wail of wights or the shriek of the Night King, just the natural lament of a cold season, indifferent to human triumph or tragedy. Jon closed his eyes, letting the wind wash over him, hoping against hope that the spirits of his family might find peace. Perhaps in time he would find a measure of peace too. But for now he only stood in the afterglow of the world's salvation, uncertain if redemption was possible for a man who had done so much wrong to achieve this fragile right. Dawn came with a pale light that spread across the snow-laden fields, revealing the magnitude of the devastation. Thousands of corpses lay in twisted heaps, friend and foe alike. Dragons perched among the rubble, wounded but watchful. Men shambled through the carnage, searching for survivors. Broken swords, tattered banners, and burned siege weapons dotted the plain. In the distance, the battered walls of Torrens Square offered little shelter against the cold. Jon rose at first light, pain lancing through his injured leg. Ghost followed on 3 good legs, the 4th bandaged by a sympathetic maester. They picked their way across the battlefield, stepping around piles of bodies, pausing to help where they could. Jon felt each breath as a burden, each heartbeat an acknowledgement of the many who would never beat again. A hush covered the plain, broken only by the crackle of dying fires. The dead no longer stirred. Eventually, Jon reached the largest cluster of survivors. Ser Davos was there, tending to the wounded, aided by Tyrion. Daenerys stood near Drogon, speaking in low tones to Grey Worm and Missandei, her face set in grim lines. As Jon approached, Grey Worm inclined his head, though his eyes remained guarded. Daenerys nodded in greeting, her gaze flicking to Jon's bandaged leg. "Your Grace," she said softly, but it was unclear to whom she addressed the title, herself or him. "We need to gather what forces remain, send out scouts, and see to the wounded. We've lost so many." Jon nodded, wincing from the ache in his leg. "Aye. We'll do what must be done. Food, water, warmth. We can scavenge the countryside for what little might remain." Tyrion stepped forward, looking from one Targaryen to the other. "When the men have recovered, we'll have to decide our next step, yes? King's Landing and the rest of the realm won't wait forever." A silent tension passed between Jon and Daenerys. They were allies in this war for the living, but that war was over. The realm would want to know who sat the Iron Throne, who would shape the future. Daenerys' eyes burned with the quiet conviction that had guided her across the sea. Jon's thoughts turned to the ghost of Robb, to the vows he had made to unite the land, to the blood he spilled. The question of rightful rulership loomed as stark as the remains of the battlefield. Yet for now, practicality dictated they remain. The living were in no state to march. Supplies were scarce, men wounded or dying, dragons in need of rest. So they lingered among the desolation, organizing funeral pyres, building crude shelters from scavenged wood, and sending out envoys to find any local lords who might offer assistance. The days blurred together in an exhausted haze. Snow continued to fall, though less heavily than before, as if the land itself was spent. Sometime during the 2nd day after the battle, a ragged company of riders approached. Northmen with wolf pelts and tired horses. At their head rode Sansa Stark. She wore a heavy cloak that bore the Stark sigil, though the edges were singed. Her hair, once so carefully groomed, hung loose and tangled, streaked with grime. Her face was pale, etched with suffering. She was accompanied by a handful of battered soldiers and refugees. When they reached the outskirts of the Targaryen encampment, the guards let them pass, for the sight of a Stark face was too surprising to bar. Jon heard the whispers and hastened to meet them, his heart pounding with mixed dread and hope. He found Sansa near the remnants of a stone archway where bodies had been piled for burning. She dismounted stiffly, wincing as she put weight on her left leg. Their eyes met across a distance of a few paces, and time seemed to slow. Jon felt that same guilt clench in his chest, memories flooding back. The day he killed Robb, the day Sansa told him she hoped he would die. She wore no expression, only a numb weariness. He spoke her name quietly. "Sansa?" She did not run to embrace him, nor did she recoil in disgust. She studied his face, seeing the scars of battle and sorrow etched there. Finally, in a low voice, she said, "The dead are gone, so the stories say. You did it." He nodded, uncertain how to respond. "All of us, Daenerys, the armies, I only played a part." She cast a glance at the black banners nearby, the 3-headed dragon flapping in the wind. "So you're a king now, truly, Targaryen, or so you claim." Jon swallowed. "It's true. I'm Rhaegar's son." A silence fell between them, the hush of old wounds. Sansa looked past him, seeing the pyres, the ruined men, the dragons roosting in the distance. "So many dead," she whispered. "I brought as many as I could, fleeing the whites. We lost so much on the road. Wolves, crows, children. She trailed off, tears glistening in her eyes. Then, with a steadiness born of heartbreak, she said, "Winterfell is lost. I am the last of the Stark line here aside from Arya, wherever she is. Bran is gone, perhaps forever. Rickon dead. Robb." Her lips trembled. Jon felt a knife twist in his chest. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice hollow. "I never wanted." She clenched her jaw, glancing at him with eyes that glinted like ice. "But you did it anyway. For the greater good," you said. "For unity." They stood there for a moment that stretched like an eternity. The wind whipped at their cloaks. Around them, men and women passed by, too drained to do more than cast curious glances. Sansa closed her eyes briefly, as if wrestling with a storm of emotion. At last, she exhaled a shaky breath. "I hate you for what you did," she said, voice breaking. "I can't help it. Robb was our hope, our king in the north. You took him from me. You damned yourself, Jon." He bowed his head. "I know." She studied him, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But you saved everyone. The dead are gone. Robb's sacrifice. Maybe it's why you could do what you did." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Maybe the gods can't either. But the realm lives." He dared not speak. Something fragile was in the air, a flicker of possible understanding amid the wreckage of their family. Sansa glanced at the ashen snow, then back at Jon. "I came to see if the rumors were true, if the Night King was truly defeated. Now I see that it is, and that you are alive." Her gaze hardened. "I won't stay here, not under your banner. I'm heading south with the survivors to see if there's any place left for us." Jon's heart twisted. "You'll find safety in the Vale or perhaps the Riverlands. We can give you supplies." She stiffened, as if ready to reject his offer out of pride. But the lines of exhaustion on her face betrayed the toll of the journey. "I'll accept," she said slowly. "For the people's sake, not for mine. These men followed me. I owe them survival if nothing else." Jon nodded, turning to call for Ser Davos or another quartermaster. But Sansa caught his arm. Her eyes glistened with conflicting emotions. "Jon," she said in a voice subdued yet urgent, "you have a chance now to rebuild what's left of this realm. Do it better than our father, better than Robb. If you truly are a Targaryen, then show the world you aren't the Mad King. I cannot forgive you. But if you can bring peace, then maybe something good can come of all this blood." A heavy weight pressed on Jon's chest. He covered her hand gently with his. "I'll try. I swear it." She withdrew her hand, stepping back. Tears threatened to spill again, but she forced composure. "Goodbye, cousin. Or should I call you Your Grace now?" He shook his head, words caught in his throat. She turned away, signaling her weary companions to follow. As they made their way through the encampment, soldiers stepped aside respectfully, some recognizing the Lady of Winterfell. Jon watched her go, feeling as though a part of him bled anew. But a faint flicker of gratitude lingered that she was alive. In the days that followed, Sansa's people rested briefly, received the supplies Jon promised, then continued south. She never spoke to him again, nor did she bid farewell to Daenerys. The last glimpse Jon had was of Sansa's cloak vanishing through the blowing snow, heading off into a wintry distance. He wondered if she would ever find a measure of peace, or if she would someday return, seeking vengeance for Robb. Perhaps the realm would see a new conflict. That was a question for another dawn. At length, Daenerys's men and Jon's men concluded there was little point in remaining near Torrhen's Square. The fortress was rubble and the north was a frozen wasteland of memories and graves. The realm's seat of power lay to the south, and the great question of who would rule had yet to be answered. So began the final march back toward the southern kingdoms. A slow, grueling journey through cold and scarcity, but nothing compared to the terror they had faced. As the living host trailed homeward, battered but unbroken, thoughts turned to the Iron Throne, to the shape of the realm that would emerge from the long night's shadow. On that journey, some lords approached Jon, openly proclaiming him the savior who destroyed the Night King. Others pressed their fealty upon Daenerys, citing her dragons and her proven leadership overseas. Yet many recognized that unity had been forged in the face of the undead, and it would be tested now that the living turned once more to ambition and memory. The realm had not forgotten the vicious means by which Jon forced the North to bend. Nor had it forgotten Daenerys' descent from the Mad King, though her heroism in the battle for survival had mitigated some distrust. The lines were blurred, alliances uncertain. Jon and Daenerys conferred often, each too exhausted to rouse the old animosity but too proud to yield their claims. Diplomacy replaced warfare. Tyrion and Davos brokered countless councils, seeking a solution that would avoid plunging Westeros back into civil strife. Neither side wanted more bloodshed, not after so many had died to stave off the greater darkness. And yet, the Iron Throne could not seat two monarchs at once unless they chose to break with centuries of tradition. There were whispers of marriage, but the memory of Daenerys' scornful dismissal lingered, along with the taboo of aunt and nephew. Even if Targaryens had wed siblings in the past, the realm might not accept it easily. Daenerys herself bristled at the notion, still haunted by Jon's reputation as a kinslayer. Jon, for his part, did not push it, uncertain if he could share a life with a woman he barely knew and who seemed to fear his capacity for cold decisions. When they reached the neck again, the snows began to recede just enough to make the roads passable. Messengers arrived from the south, bearing news that Cersei Lannister was dead, poisoned, some said, in the chaos that followed the Alliance's departure. Others claimed she took her own life upon hearing of the Night King's unstoppable advance. Whoever held King's Landing now was unclear, but the Lannister grip had weakened considerably. The small folk, traumatized by war, might rally behind whichever Targaryen arrived with a promise of stability. In the Vale, young Lord Robb was rumored to be vacillating over which Targaryen to support or whether to claim independence. The Reach, devastated by earlier battles, hungered for peace above all. Dorne kept its counsel as it often did, waiting to see which way the sands would shift. With the capital in flux, Daenerys insisted on pressing south at once to secure the city and claim the throne that was rightfully hers. Jon bristled, for he too had a legitimate claim by birth. But his heart was heavy and he was tired. He had forced a war upon his brother to unify the realm in time to fight the dead. That war had cost him everything. Now the dead were vanquished. Did he have the stomach to wage another war, this time against his own kin, Targaryen blood? Perhaps he should simply let her have the throne. But he remembered the vow he made to Robb in the silent halls of Winterfell, that the realm would not stand divided. If Daenerys took the throne, would she respect the North's battered autonomy, or would she rule with the same unyielding approach Jon had shown? The realm's fate was precarious. Every step southward reopened the question, yield or contend. Day by day, their armies shrank. Soldiers deserted, returning to families in the Riverlands or the Reach, seeking rest from the endless wars. Others died of lingering wounds. Still others pledged themselves to local lords once they saw that the White Walkers were no longer a threat. By the time Jon and Daenerys reached the outskirts of King's Landing, what remained was a leaner force, scarred and grim. The city loomed ahead, battered by previous wars, its walls repaired with patchwork. Smoke curled from the chimneys of frightened inhabitants, uncertain what new cataclysm approached. Outside the gates, Daenerys' banner of the three-headed dragon flew beside Jon's identical standard, dividing the watchers on the ramparts. They whispered of two Targaryens returned, saviors of the realm, or perhaps conquerors. The gates remained shut, for the city's new council did not know whom to allow entry. Rumors said that Taming or Joffrey might be alive or dead, that a council of lesser lords held the city. Or perhaps the Gold Cloaks had seized control. No one seemed certain. 2 days of tense parley followed, with envoys scuttling back and forth. At last, a crumbling truce was agreed upon. Jon and Daenerys could enter the city with a small escort to address the people and the council. The men on the walls prayed they would not bring dragons to burn the city once again. The tension was palpable. On the morning of entry, Daenerys rode atop Drogon, who was still scarred from the battle. Regal and Viserion circled overhead. She approached the city's main gate but landed outside so as not to incite panic with a direct flight over the walls. Jon, limping from his old wound, rode a horse at her side, ghost-trotting behind. The battered column of survivors followed. King's Landing stood silent, the gates creaking open to admit them. Crowds of small folk lined the streets at a cautious distance, eyes wide with fear, or perhaps glimmers of hope. They had heard rumors of the Great War in the north, of dragons unleashed, of the Night King's defeat, but they knew little else. More than once, Jon caught a glimpse of children with hollow cheeks staring at him with puzzlement. They halted in the Red Keep's courtyard, where once the Targaryens had reigned before the Baratheon usurpation. Daenerys dismounted, scanning the ancient walls. Jon joined her, noticing the scorch marks from previous battles. Soldiers in battered Lannister livery stood uncertainly by, apparently sworn to serve whoever claimed the throne. A crowd of lords and ladies, minor and middling, had gathered behind them, the city's makeshift council. Their expressions ranged from awe to trepidation. No sign of a Baratheon or a recognized Lannister with any real power remained. Daenerys looked at Jon, a moment of tension passing between them. The city was there for the taking, but by whom? Tyrion and Davos stepped forward to greet the council. They introduced Jon and Daenerys, recounting how these two Targaryens had united to defeat the threat that could have destroyed Westeros. The hush was profound when Tyrion concluded. Then Daenerys spoke, her voice ringing in the courtyard's stillness. She declared her lineage, her right, and her desire to see Westeros rebuilt under a fair and just rule. She promised no more tyrants, no more war, that the wheel would be broken. The onlookers murmured, uncertain whether to believe the queen with dragons. Jon stood silent, head bowed. He felt all eyes shift to him. The council waited to hear the man whispered to be Rhaegar's son, the man who killed the king in the north but also slew the Night King. In that hush, he recalled the vow he made to unite the realm, the blood spilled in the name of unity. If he pressed his claim, the realm might split again, Targaryen fighting Targaryen, more blood soaking the ground. Could he endure that? Or was the realm best served by a single, uncontested monarch? He remembered Sansa's words, do it better, bring peace. Perhaps he could, but not as king. He turned to Daenerys, meeting her gaze. She stood tall, regal, the fire of her convictions in her eyes. Whatever her flaws, she had traveled the world freeing slaves, forging alliances, and braving horrors. Perhaps she would rule justly here if guided well. Perhaps. The alternative was more war. Jon's heart pounded, and he knew this was the moment. A hush fell so thick that one could hear the flap of a distant banner in the breeze. Bending his knee with a soft groan, Jon lowered his head before Daenerys. He offered Longclaw's hilt up, a gesture of fealty. Gasps rippled through the courtyard. Tyrion's mouth hung open. Davos stood in surprise, and even Daenerys' eyes widened. Jon spoke, his voice clear and steady. You are Daenerys Targaryen, first of your name, queen of the Undulls and the first men, protector of the realm. I bend the knee, for I have seen your strength, your sacrifice. I have done terrible things to unite this realm, and I will not see it torn apart by yet another war. The Iron Throne is yours. A murmur of astonishment spread. Daenerys stared at him, her lips parted. She had expected conflict, had steeled herself for it. Now, the man who had every right to claim the crown yielded it willingly. The courtyard fell silent as snow drifted from the sky, the last remnants of winter in King's Landing. In a voice unsteady with emotion, Daenerys bade him rise. Aegon Targaryen, she said, I accept your fealty, and I promise to rule with the wisdom and mercy I have learned, from Essos to Westeros. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, the Watchers exhaled, as though an enormous weight had lifted from the city. Jon rose slowly, wincing at his leg, and they stood eye to eye, two Targaryens who had braved the long night. A roar of approval began among the small folk who had crowded into the courtyard, or maybe it was just a handful who started cheering. But it spread quickly, relief mingled with awe. Tyrion allowed himself a small, genuine smile. Davos bowed his head in weary acceptance. Grey Worm observed with guarded relief. The battered lords and ladies of King's Landing knelt to Daenerys, relief etched on their faces. Dragon wings beat overhead, the living beasts letting out thunderous calls, as if saluting a new age. Thus it was that Daenerys Stormborn assumed the mantle of Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, with no further civil war. Jon's crown vanished as quietly as it had been imposed. He had paid dearly to unify the realm in time for the long night, but now, with that night ended, he chose not to contest the spoils. The memory of Robb's execution still haunted him, a ghost that would never fade, but perhaps it would serve as a reminder of what he had sacrificed to give the living a chance. Ceremonies followed, subdued but heartfelt, as Daenerys was crowned within the Red Keep. The city's folk came out in droves to witness the dragons perched on the ramparts, the two Targaryens side by side. For many, the idea that House Targaryen had returned to power was unsettling, yet better than endless war. At the coronation feast, minimal though it was due to the city's hardships, Daenerys recognized Jon as her Lord Paramount of the North, if the North would have him. Whether they would ever forgive him remained uncertain. Sansa had departed for the South, carrying her grief and anger. The fate of the Stark lineage was an open wound. Over the following weeks, Queen Daenerys set about reorganizing the city, appointing new officials, working alongside Tyrion as Hand, Davos as a key advisor, and other worthy men and women who had survived the wars. Jon lingered in King's Landing, partly to recover from his wounds, partly out of a sense of duty to help rebuild what he had nearly destroyed. He walked the streets, speaking to blacksmiths, orphans, and fisherfolk. They did not look at him as they had Robb Stark or King Tommen, for he was not the king on the Iron Throne. He was, to most, just a somber man with a limp, rumored to be a Targaryen who had done dark deeds far away in the north. And perhaps that was enough. He was done with crowns. Sometimes he gazed upon the newly hoisted banner atop the Red Keep, a three-headed dragon on a field of black, and thought of his father, Rhaegar, and the tragedies that had shaped the realm. Other times, he dreamed of the crypts of Winterfell, of Ned Stark's statue, of Robb's ghost. He knew that for all his good intentions, for all the realm's survival, he might never wash away the stain of kinslaying. Yet the living had endured the greatest threat in millennia. If Westeros could heal, if children could grow without the fear of undead or the tyranny of monstrous kings, perhaps that was enough penance. One morning, as he stood on a balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay, Daenerys joined him. The sea wind whipped her hair, and for a moment, he recalled seeing her in the howling snows of the north, commanding dragons. She asked if he planned to stay, or if he would return to the north to attempt to mend what remained of House Stark's dominion. He thought of Sansa's hatred, the North's wounds, the undone tasks. The future was unclear. At last, he answered that he did not know. The North might never accept him again, not after what he'd done to Robb. Yet it was still the land of his mother, Lyanna Stark, and once the place he called home. Daenerys rested a hand on the stone balustrade, her gaze distant. She spoke of her vision for a realm freed from the cycle of fear and oppression, a realm where the common folk might flourish. She admitted she did not know if she could achieve it, but she would try. Jon gave a slight nod, acknowledging the enormity of the task. They stood in silence, two Targaryens bound by blood and war, neither triumph nor condemnation passing between them. Whatever they had been before was gone. Now they were just two survivors tasked with the stewardship of a realm left in ruins. A few days later, Jon prepared to depart the city. With Davos's help, he assembled a small retinue of loyal men, along with a handful of wagons carrying resources for the ravaged north. His plan was to travel to Winterfell, see if anything remained that could be rebuilt, perhaps attempt to restore some measure of order. Queen Daenerys offered him an escort, but he declined, preferring a quieter approach. She did not argue. The day he rode from the Red Keep, Daenerys stood on the steps, her dragon eggs in the background, a solemn retinue of Unsullied behind her. She inclined her head, as if wishing him well. He bowed not as a king, but as a subject, yet also as an equal who had fought alongside her in the greatest war Westeros had ever known. The city gates parted. The crowd murmured as Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen to some, kinslayer to others, savior to yet more, passed through. Ghost padded at his side, the wolf scars matching Jon's own. As they reached the open road, snow began to fall again, a light dusting. It was a reminder that winter was not fully gone, that the realm still bore deep wounds. Yet the undead threat had been vanquished, and if the gods were kind, a new spring would come eventually. Jon guided his horse north, uncertain of what welcome or condemnation awaited him at Winterfell. He clutched the reins, remembering Robb's final moments. He recalled Sansa's words, her heartbreak. If it was within his power, he would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for that act, even if true forgiveness never came. The road stretched out before him, endless and lonely. Behind him, a Targaryen queen ruled a battered realm, forging alliances, dispensing justice as best she could. Between them lay a shared past that neither could erase. But the future would be written by the living, for they had survived the long night. As the wind picked up, Jon raised the hood of his cloak, feeling the sting of cold on his cheeks. Ghost trotted closer, pressing a warm flank against his leg. They continued at a steady pace, leaving the walls of King's Landing behind. Ahead lay the wide swaths of the riverlands, the neck, and eventually the frozen moors of the north. Perhaps he would find Sansa again, or perhaps Arya would emerge from the shadows to exact vengeance. Perhaps the lords of the north would cast him out. He would accept whatever came. He was no longer a king, but he had shaped the fate of kings. Now he sought only a measure of peace. And so, with the snow drifting lazily from an overcast sky, Jon Snow rode onward, carrying the ghosts of his past and the faint glimmer of hope for tomorrow. The realm had been saved from darkness at a price that would echo through ballads and nightmares for generations. Winter would pass. Spring would follow. And in that cycle, perhaps someday, the memory of betrayal and blood might fade, leaving only the truth that the living had stood against the dead and won. It was enough. For now.